Well, we'd like to welcome you for what we hope is going to be a very enlightening and powerful day of discussion about issues that have been too much neglected, especially here in Washington and in the legislative process. And we hope to inject a lot of new information into the discussions that are taking place. Before we do that, we have a welcome video from Chris Murphy.
Hey everybody, this is United States Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. I want to thank the UCLA Civil Rights Project for convening this really important meeting on the continued scourge of segregation in the American public school system. A lot of folks might think that this is something that is just a matter of history books. It's not. Segregation, both racial and economic, is alive and well, and in many parts of the country growing. We have seen the number of intensely segregated schools, for instance, that have 90% of their student body non-white, double over the past several years. We are a more racially and economically segregated society when it comes to how our children interact with learning today than we were decades ago, and we should not accept that. We shouldn't accept it because that kind of exclusion is bad for our kids. Our kids cannot succeed in life if they don't grow up with people from different backgrounds, of different incomes, of different races. It's bad for our kids as learners, but it's also terrible for our society, because if you don't grow up with people who have a different background, a different income, a different race, a different religion, then you are much more likely to be hoodwinked by theories and messages of division, by political leaders, by demagogues who are trying to divide us from each other culturally, socially, and economically. So to me, this is a really important moment to invest in schools and school districts that are trying to do more integration. And so that's why I've been the sponsor of legislation for the past half a decade that would put $100 million every year into voluntary desegregation efforts, whether those be choice programs, busing programs, magnet schools. This to me is work still undone. And so I will continue to lift up this really important work as the father of two young men who go to very racially and economically integrated schools. I've seen for myself what kind of value that brings to their educational experience. So thanks for the work that you're doing today to try to midwife ideas and advocacy around the constant work to build diverse, inclusionary schools, and I look forward to hearing the product of this important meeting.
Well, we are very grateful to Senator Murphy, and we are very happy to welcome you here. The Senate is having a Democratic retreat today, so we're not going to get an actual senator here, but hopefully they're doing some really important work on these issues in their retreat. So before we get started, I just want to express appreciation for all of those who have co-sponsored this event, and for the Hewlett Foundation, which gave us the money to do it, and to our collaborators, especially in the National Coalition for School Diversity, which has been very supportive of this effort, and to all of the groups that have signed on as co-sponsors of this event. We appreciate it very much, and we look forward to working with them as these things spin out from ideas into action. Let me just say a word about the Civil Rights Project before we get started. Civil Rights Project was created in 1996 in Harvard University in response to the ending of affirmative action in some of our largest states. It has sponsored more and commissioned more than 500 studies of civil rights issues, produced a couple of dozen books, been very involved in Supreme Court amicus briefs, and many other activities. and produced a lot of the leading scholars who work in this field, who are now in universities all over the United States. Our objective is to create new information that informs the debate on civil rights as it goes, as the country changes. The country is in a period of extremely dramatic change and very dangerous polarization. And these issues are deeply rooted in race and in exploitation of fears about racial change and other issues of that sort. We believe that injection of new data, new basic information is part of what has to happen in the country for things to come out better. So we're going to get right into it. But I should say, we decided to do this to celebrate our 25th anniversary. We decided we shouldn't just have a celebration. We decided to think about the next 25 years, the next generation, because the country's changing. We haven't had a new major civil rights law since 1968. We haven't had any significant money for supporting race relations in schools since it was eliminated in the first Reagan budget. We have had a vacuum of policy as the country's gone through the kind of very dramatic change you're going to be hearing about today. Let me introduce the members of the panel. We've given them all very strict time limits, as you do at congressional hearings, so we can save some time for questions. We want you to think of really hard questions. We don't want to hear speeches from anybody. We want to hear hard questions for our panels. Okay, on this panel, we have the following folks. We have Ryan Flegler. Ryan, he's a senior policy researcher at the Civil Rights Project, and he has provided a lot of the data you'll hear in the first presentation, and has worked active on education and policymaking issues. Next presentation will be by Jennifer Van Hook. Jennifer is a professor of sociology and demography at Penn State University and a fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. She's working on new estimates of undocumented foreign-born population. Exactly the kind of things that so much stupid political discussion is about these days. Next will come Erica Frankenberg. Erica, oh, there she is. Erica is a professor of education and demography and an affiliate with the law faculty at Penn State University, director of the Center for Education and Civil Rights, associate director of the Social Science Research Institute, and has been a longtime collaborator of the Civil Rights Project. Next will come Carolyn Liebler. Carolyn is a associate professor of sociology and an affiliate of the Institute of Social Research and Data Innovation at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. Her research focuses on the intersection of population studies and social construction of race, with a special emphasis on how data is created for indigenous people and tribal nations. Something that's almost always lacking in serious reports on civil rights is basic data about native populations, which include hundreds of separate Indian tribes. Susan Faircloth is the last of our panel. Susan is a member of the Cocaine Tribe of North Carolina and chair of the Technical Research Review Panel for the National Indian Education Study, which was a study of 4th and 8th grade students across the country, and she's been very interested in special education issues. So one of the things that we decided about this is almost always in these events, Native Americans aren't really covered very much because it's a small and complicated population. It's not small in number, it's small in percentages, and it's often excluded from surveys. So we decided to include it in an effective way in this panel. So without further ado, we're going to turn to our first speaker. That would be Ryan.
Hi, I am happy to be here again. Actually, the last time I worked here was about 25 years ago in a very different capacity as a bike courier delivering packages to senators' offices. So yeah, now I'm the senior policy researcher at the Civil Rights Project, as Gary said, and my research focuses on the social and economic context
Thanks. My research focuses on the social and economic context of education with an eye on inequality. And today I'd like to talk about a fundamental inequality Professor Orfield and I examined in our forthcoming report, and that is segregation in U.S. public schools since the Supreme Court declared it illegal in 1954. So we analyzed more than 15 million records of public school demographics across multiple national data sets. And today, I'll briefly cover two basic claims that that stem from our analysis. And the first is a harmful segregation in schools is rising. And second, segregation is high today because of changes in policy. So let's delve a bit into the first idea that a harmful segregation is rising. Segregation is not merely a remnant of the past. The proportion of schools that are intensely segregated with less than 10% white students nearly tripled over the last 30 years, rising, as you can see, to nearly 20% in 2022. We also observed an increase in several other measures of segregation. And these kinds of segregation matter. The negative effects of segregation are increasingly well documented. Of prime importance is that segregation produces and reproduces inequality. Segregation reduces access to advanced courses, experienced teachers, and reduces the chances of high school graduation. And a growing body of evidence finds negative effects on employment and income and even health. And a large body of research also concludes that integration reduces prejudice. So segregation is not some clear or natural effect of changing racial demographics, although American schools are clearly becoming less white and more multiracial. So for example, students today make up 45% of enrollment in public schools, down from 81% a half century ago. And Latinos make up nearly 30%, which is a six-fold increase over the same time period. And we can think about the most segregated states in the nation by examining exposure statistics alongside basic demographics. And we can take California for an example here. California is one state that had a significant change in racial composition. That is, it became much more Latino and less white, alongside an increase in segregation in recent decades. So today, California is the most segregated state when we examine Black to white exposure and Latino to white exposure. And if schools were just segregated by race, we would have a problem, but it does not stop there. A high level of racial and economic segregation overlaps. Being in a Black or Latino school means being in a school with a high level of poverty. This is not the case on average for white and Asian students. In 2022, nearly 83% of students were poor in schools with high proportions of Black, Latino, multiracial, and American Indian students, as you can see at the end of the top line. In contrast, the rate of poverty was less than half that in schools that were overwhelmingly white and Asian. Schools with the highest levels of poverty face more problems, which white and Asian students are much less likely to experience. And note that here the poverty rate in both kinds of schools increased over time. But one important fact is that the persistence of the gap in exposure to poverty is rather consistent and persistent. So on to the second big point, today's segregation is high because of changes in policy. The South provides an example of this. So virtually all Black students in the South were segregated before Brown. Then desegregation of Southern Black students grew rapidly. And the share of Black students in majority white schools in the South reached a peak in the 1980s, and since then it declined steadily. So our analysis also found that all Southern states followed this general trend. The places and times legal and policy efforts were put into action, such as in the American South in the 1960s and 70s, desegregation rose. but the major efforts to desegregate stopped and reversed. Enforcement of civil rights violations diminished. The Supreme Court directed federal courts to terminate desegregation orders in 1991. Financial resources to desegregate are now rather inconsequential. And the prevailing reforms in education reform have shifted away from desegregation to test-based accountability, charter schooling, vouchers, and many, many other reforms. Our paper and the others discussed today list dozens of reforms that could help desegregation moving forward. And I look forward to a discussion of those and hearing about those other ones from other presenters. For now, I'll conclude with this final point, and that is that the rise in segregation, the rise in integration, starting in the 1960s, is substantial. I look at it and I'm genuinely wowed every time I see it. Like, this is a major change in society. So when we tried, we integrated, and since then, integration decreased along with opportunities for students of color. Yet I believe this trend can be reversed by organized efforts to change policy. So thanks.
Thank you. We'll next turn to Jennifer Van Hook, who's helping us understand how the country's changing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for allowing me to take a bit of your time. I'm a demographer. I work closely with other people, like at the Census Bureau, and in this project, I'm working with a team from the University of Montreal, so we're an international team, and developing measures and projections of the composition of the school-age population for the United States. One of the big things, and I think you'll all be familiar with this, ever since the passage of the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, there's been a big change in immigration and larger increases of immigrants from Latin America and Asia. And this has really changed our society from being mostly a black-white society to one involving a whole patchwork of different racial and ethnic groups. And so this is continuing into the future. And so here I'm going to share with you some estimates of projected composition of the child age population going forward to 2050. So here, some of you might have be aware of the fact that for the overall US population, the projection is that by 2044, we will be becoming a minority-majority nation. In the case of children, this has already happened. As of 2018, 50% of children were non-Hispanic white, and 50% were of some other racial or ethnic group. By 2050, we're projecting this to go down to 42%. At the same time, we're projecting increases in the share of children who identify as Hispanic, small changes in the percentage who identify as Black or African American, increases in the share of children who are of Asian or Pacific Islander origins, and then smaller increases in the share of children who are white and some other race or some other race altogether. So these are what we're expecting to see over time if current patterns in trends in immigration, fertility, and mortality were to continue into the future. These estimates, by the way, are very similar to what you will find if you go and look at the Census Bureau's estimates. But we use a different methodology here, and so it's nice that they line up with what we see at the Census Bureau. Another thing that we're able to do in our estimates is we use a microsimulation approach, which enables us to look more deeply at the characteristics and the locations of these different populations. And so what we're seeing here with these maps is how much diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, would we expect to find by region if current patterns of internal migration were to continue the way that they've been operating today into the future. And already we're seeing increasing racial and ethnic diversity more than just on the coasts, but throughout the entire United States. These patterns and trends are already happening, and if we kind of project this forward, we would expect to see much more diversity across all regions and major cities in the United States. One of the most interesting things that we noticed is that places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. are already very diverse and heterogeneous with respect to race and ethnicity, and so there's not much room for change. It's really the places that are less diverse that we expect there to be the greatest amount of change over time. So like St. Louis or Boston. Another thing that was popped out in our findings is what is the role of immigration in the future for this? Immigration in the future is one of those policy-dependent kinds of variables. It's not the same as mortality and fertility, where we have pretty much kind of know what's going to happen. There's not a lot of wiggle room in that. But immigration, it seems like something that's policy-dependent. However, in the case of children, when we project forward the race and ethnicity of children, most of the children we're talking about are US born already. And so changes in immigration is unlikely to change the future in terms of the race and ethnic composition of this group. So here we see for 2020, the share of US born, non-Hispanic whites would be 50%. 42% if current trends in immigration were to continue would be non-Hispanic white by 2050. If immigration were cut in half, this would increase by 2 percentage points to 44%. If immigration were increased by 50%, it would go down to about 40%. But regardless of the immigration scenario, all of them are quite a bit lower than the current 2020 estimate. Most of this change comes about not because of changes or variations in the percentage that are Hispanic or Latino, but changes in the percentage that are Asian, because that's where more of the foreign-born population is located. Another thing that is interesting is that these groups they're not static. They're likely to change over time. One of the things that is majorly changing for these groups is that they're becoming less associated with immigration. So this is the share projected to have immigrant parents. As you can see, the share of Hispanic children with immigrant parents, with at least one immigrant parent, is likely to decline dramatically over time. And with that change, we're likely to see large changes in the share that, for example, speak English at home. And large changes in the share that have a college degree. So what I'm showing you here is the projected percentage of children who are likely to go on to college, given the current trajectories that they have in schooling today, and given the level of education of their parents. And so we are projecting a small change in improvement for Hispanics over time, yet it is not enough. As you can see, if nothing were to change in the way that that children are doing in school and their trajectories, they still would not meet up with the levels that we see for non-Hispanic whites. And African Americans actually wouldn't change at all in this scenario. So I have no more time, but if you are interested in these results, please go see my report.
Let me say, all of the reports that have already been published are available on the website of the Civil Rights Project, civilrightsproject.ucla.edu. They're available free of charge. There's no cost barrier. And the ones that aren't finished or who haven't been published yet will be available in the coming days. So we hope that they will be widely used. Erica Frankenberg will come next to tell us about what's happening with the radical transformation of suburban America. We're talking about, in terms of the last presentation, about a world where we're having debates about immigration, which really aren't so much about immigration as they are about the existing population and age structure of the country already. Now, Erica is going to talk to you about, we are a suburban society without any policies for suburban diversity.
Well, Gary's already given away the punchline of what our paper is about, so I could cede my 7 minutes. Yes, welcome. I'm going to shift a little bit from my presenters who have already sort of broadly laid the groundwork for me to talk about the suburban nation that we are. We have been a suburban nation for many decades now. 30% of the public school enrollment in the entire nation is enrolled in suburban districts in our largest 25 metropolitan areas. So you may think, well, the suburbs just of the largest 25 may not make a difference, but that's a profound share of our public school enrollment. And the suburbs could potentially offer a possibility. That's why I first got interested in studying it as a place in which racial change is happening. But what I'm going to tell you is that because we've had no major policy efforts from Congress for the last half century, a result of the school segregation is instead growing to a larger geographic scale beyond our urban cores in our nation's largest metropolitan areas. Brief background, the settlement of the suburbs, of course, was structured and supported by discriminatory government policies that facilitated the expansion of white people settling the suburbs after World War II. Cities became disproportionately Black and Latino. That was also aided by other urban policies as well. In some places, and this is often the case in the South, the urban cores were surrounded by the white suburban areas were encompassed in large countywide school districts. So they were in the same school district. But in most places outside of the South, the Northeast, Midwest in particular, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of school districts in major metropolitan areas. These school district boundaries came to matter very significantly 50 years ago this year when the Milliken v. Bradley decision was handed down by the Supreme Court that limited the extent to which school desegregation remedies could cross school district boundary lines. In essence, it made these school district boundary lines more meaningful, and it walled off the potential of students crossing desegregations. This was about Detroit, which already was a majority Black district, surrounded by 54 mostly white suburban districts outside of Detroit. So this first setback to school desegregation, the first in the 20 years after the Brown decision, basically walled off the suburbs. And as our paper shows, and this is a paper I've done with Genevieve Siegel-Hawley from Virginia Commonwealth University, this is having a really profound impact on many of the inner ring suburbs today. In particular, in these fragmented metropolitan areas, which are, again, mostly outside of the South, suburban districts and communities represent such a small percentage of the metropolitan area that they are really, without any regional planning or cross-sector policy efforts, they are sort of beholden to the racial transition that's rapidly changing these very small communities. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of the effects of those changes today. And these are only a few of the many tables and charts you can get in our full report. So first, when we look at the children who are growing up in the suburbs of our nation's largest 25 metropolitan areas, it's not maybe the typical suburban ideal that has been portrayed in popular media. Overwhelmingly, the children in these largest 25 metropolitan areas in the suburbs are actually, we have students of color who are the majority. More than 60% of Black children, Latinx students, and Asian children in these large metropolitan areas, furthermore, are in suburban schools, not in urban schools. So also how we think about where the concentrations of students of color are, they're really in the suburban areas and not in our urban core. And I think that's an important thing for policy to realize as well. In all of the regions of the country, and we have all the different regions in terms of the sort of education policy that's developed, and we separate out Florida, actually, not to say that Florida is its own region, although some may think that. Instead, it has countywide school districts, and so it's hard to disentangle what is just suburban because urban cores, for example, Miami, is actually designated as a suburban district. So that's a little why that's separate. In every region, though, you see the percentage of white students declining. And in fact, the average white decline in less than a decade is 7.5 percentage points. So really rapid decline in the suburbs year over year. The areas that experience the largest decline are the ones in white students were the ones that are most homogenous, the Midwest and the Northeast, very dramatic declines in relatively short amount of times. Similarly, we see Latinx students increasing everywhere. The West has the highest percentage of suburban students, almost half of suburban students in the Western metropolitan areas are Latinx students, but in every region, the Latinx students are growing rapidly. In 5 of the 25 metros, Latinx students are actually the majority of suburban students. Regionally, Black students are remaining about the same in the time period we looked at, although in the South in particular, we're seeing the return migration of Black students are going to the suburbs. This is the obviously most largest in suburban Atlanta. Asian students also are increasingly going to the suburbs. We see a number of metropolitan areas, particularly in the West, that have 10% or more students who are Asian, and really rapid growth in multiracial students as well. So we're seeing both a decline in the white, but also really multifaceted diversity in the suburbs here. Since Ryan's already talked a little bit about why segregation matters, I can skip that. Also, if you're here, you probably have some idea. So what I want to instead talk about is what this fragmentation and racial change looks like at the school district level in the suburbs. And so here I have looking at racial concentration, we see a dramatic sea change. The percentage of students in 90 to 100% Black and Latinx school districts was smaller than concentrated in white and Asian districts in 2011. That has flipped by 2020. And in fact, we see 22% of Latinx students in the suburbs in these extremely concentrated, racially concentrated school districts. This also overlaps with poverty in ways that are really consequential for the funding of these schools. And you see white segregation declining. This is, again, why white people might also think that school segregation is declining, because their segregation is declining, but we're not seeing the reverse that comes true. This segregation is less so in places that have less suburban fragmentation. And then one last slide to briefly close with, what does this look like at school level? Again, like Ryan showed, you have differential exposure to low-income students. White and Asian students have half the exposure at the school level and the suburbs to low-income students. That's doubled by Black and Latinx students. And this really matters for the kind of learning opportunities these students have. I ran out of time for my suggestions, so maybe you can ask me in the Q&A.
So we see the country becoming much more diverse and much more doubly segregated by race and poverty in terms of the education and development of our young people. We're going to now turn to look at the Native American population and the conditions that affect people of tribal backgrounds in our society, and present to us the basic demographics of Indian tribes.
Thank you for being here at this important event. Great to see so many people. In order to address structural disadvantages impacting the civil rights of American Indians and Alaska Natives, we need basic information about the population, including plausible projections about its future size and composition. Unfortunately, and unfairly, data collection challenges impact Indigenous people more than other groups, and also traditional demographic methods fall short. So in my report, I discuss issues with data about American Indians and Alaska Natives, and then develop population projections of the racially identified American Indian Alaska Native population for the next quarter century. To do this, I used a traditional demographic method that I modified to account for the most significant data-related challenges. Because the past creates the present and is important for interpreting my results, I'd like to begin with some history of census data about American Indian people. You can find a lot more information about this in my report. So from 1890, when the federal government first started trying to count all American Indian people, through 1950, a number of factors kept the counts low. Sometimes violent assimilation programs were active and discouraged American Indian culture, language, identity, and trust in the government. Enumerators gathered census data, deciding for themselves which race to assign each person, and rarely assigning American Indian to someone who is living outside of a reservation. So population increase was slow, with an average annual increase of less than 1%. Starting in 1960 and continuing to today, the American Indian and Alaska Native population has grown at a different pace. Self-identification was possible starting in 1960. So previously misclassified people were able to classify themselves correctly. Some people changed their race response to reclaim American Indian, Alaska Native identities as tribal sovereignty increased and racism changed. And the definition of the group also expanded, including Alaska Natives when Alaska joined the Union, as well as including Indigenous people from Central and South America as of 2000, increasing the Hispanic American Indian population. So from 1950 to 2020, the average annual increase of the American Indian and Alaska Native population was 4.6%. Given this history of American Indian and Alaska Native population growth, the Census Bureau's projection of the future population size are dramatically unrealistic. What you see here is the two most recent projections by the Census Bureau. In contrast to what Jenny said, for the other groups, these are not useful. Both are projecting a steep decline in the rate of growth of the American Indian Alaska Native population. Their 2017 projection, for example, which is the higher one, has an average annual growth rate of 1.5%, which is 1/3 as large as the prior half century. One of the major reasons that their results predict a decline is that they're only taking into account fertility and mortality and not taking into account response change. This is where a person with mixed racial heritage changes their answer to the race question. This is quite common in all groups and especially impacts the American Indian Alaska Native population because there's such a long history of intermarriage, forced assimilation programs, and revitalized connections to tribes and heritage. So for my projections of the future size of the racially identified American Indian Alaska Native population, I took into account what we know about recent patterns of race response change. My results give a much more plausible pattern with an average annual growth rate of 3% rather than the Census Bureau's 1.5%, and recall that the average between 1950 and 2020 was 4.6%. So mine is in the middle there, by coincidence. I project that the American Indian Alaska Native population may grow to 13.6 million by 2030, 18.4 million by 2040, and 23.9 million by 2050. It was 9.7 million in the 2020 census. In my report, I also provide some details about the expected composition of the American Indian Alaska Native population. Many American Indian Alaska Native people live in tribal areas, such as reservations, and are members of federally recognized tribes. So that's this group that I'm showing now. People living in tribal areas are especially likely to report one race. That's the black bar. Often as a political claim rather than a reference to their family tree. A few in this group are Hispanic. Those living outside tribal areas are a more diverse set, but they do include many people who are enrolled in federally recognized tribes. You wouldn't want to assume otherwise. Outside tribal areas, we see more Hispanic American Indians, many of whom have roots in Central and South American indigenous groups. We also see more people reporting multiple races. Often, multiple race American Indian, Alaska Native people have one Native parent, or it could be from a previous generation. Again, please remember it's important not to make assumptions about the tribal enrollment or connectedness of American Indian, Alaska Native people who are living outside of tribal areas. All of these groups have been impacted by intense histories of colonialism and domination, whether or not they're living in tribal areas, and whether or not they have other backgrounds as well. So overall, my work shows that American Indians and Alaska Natives are not a disappearing population. They are strong, growing, diverse. People rely on population projections to plan for the future, a future which will require, for example, culturally relevant schooling for many Indigenous children. I will take my last second to just call out the Census Bureau that they need to do a lot better.
Susan Faircloth will help take us from the numbers into some of the basic concerns that are facing the Indian population.
Good afternoon. So I'm honored to join this esteemed panel today, and I will say I will provide lots less demographic data than Dr. Liebler has provided. My task was to really look at what are some of the potential policy and practical implications based on the data around American Indians and Alaska Natives. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Native nations and peoples on whose homelands we engage in this conversation today, particularly the Piscataway, the Pamunkey, the Nanachoke, the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, the Monacan, the Powhatan, the Rappahannock, and many others. As a Native American tribal citizen, mother, daughter, auntie, and scholar, I'm heartened by recent efforts of the U.S. Department of the Interior, particularly under the leadership of Secretary Howland, who is the first American Indian woman to hold a cabinet-level position, to acknowledge and redress atrocities committed against the more than 600 state and federally recognized tribal nations across the United States. Under Secretary Howland's leadership, the U.S. government is working to acknowledge and right past injustices and to move forward in the spirit of honoring the federal trust responsibility for the health, education, and welfare of American Indian peoples and nations, a responsibility that is legally and politically grounded in nearly 400 treaties entered into between the United States government and tribal nations. And in saying that, I think it is particularly important to acknowledge the large number of treaties that were abrogated, violated, disregarded, and broken in the relationship between the U.S. government and tribal nations. As I argue in my paper, failure to honor this trust responsibility will continue to place the future well-being of this nation's original peoples at risk. As Native and non-Natives alike have argued, this is a moral, ethical, political, and legal failure. To rewrite these issues, the federal government and its actors must commit to the principles, number one, of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, principles that emerged during the 1960s in conjunction with the National Civil Rights Movement. Along with states and tribes, the federal government must also work to do the following. Number one, to lessen disproportionate involvement in the criminal justice system, particularly among American Indian children and youth, as well as violence against Native women, which results in a devastatingly high number of missing and murdered American Indian and Alaska Native women across this nation. Number two, we must work to ensure that Native nations have the infrastructure and capacity necessary to develop and sustain economic self-sufficiency, which is critically important for tribal nations to be truly self-determined nations. This is particularly important when we consider the fact that there are large swaths of Indian country that still do not have access to electricity, to running water, to potable water, to broadband internet services, paved roads, and other services and utilities. Number three, we must ensure that American Indian and Alaska Native students, my daughter is one of those students. My daughter, Journey, who's 14, joined me today. Now, she said if the president were here, she'd have lots of questions and lots of recommendations, and I think it's critically important to listen to the voices of our children. But we must ensure that American Indian and Alaska Native students no longer attend under-resourced and physically, culturally, and emotionally unsafe schools, many of which are located in rural, remote, and geographically isolated areas. And we must ensure that our students are able to be taught and to be led by teachers and school leaders who share and appreciate our Indigenous languages and cultures. The majority of Native students do attend schools in which 25% or less of the student population is American Indian or Alaska Native. We refer to those schools as being low-density schools. Approximately 8% of our students attend schools that are funded and are operated by the Bureau of Indian Education, which is located within the Department of the Interior, and they also attend schools that are operated or funded by tribes. We refer to these schools as high-density schools, where 25% or more of the student population is American Indian, Alaska Native. Recent reports from the USGAO document recurrent, ongoing safety issues across Bureau of Indian Education funded and or operated schools. These are facilities issues, large numbers of students who are at risk physically, emotionally, and culturally. Number 4, we must lessen disparities in health and wellness that contribute to decreased life expectancy for Native peoples. This is particularly important given that American Indian and Alaska Native peoples experience some of the highest rates of heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and other diseases across the nation. Number 5, ensure that the nearly 200 indigenous languages still spoken today have the necessary supports and resources to ensure that they do not become extinct. This is critically important given documented evidence indicating that language is critical to the sustainment of Native cultures and in turn to the ability of Native nations and communities to sustain themselves. As an American Indian woman and a member of a state-recognized tribe, and I make the distinction between federal and state, I know firsthand the devastating effects of having our native languages stolen, and I use the language of stolen as opposed to lost, or as Drs. Terry McCarty and Tiffany Lee describe as linguicide, an intentional act of language erasure aimed at assimilation, acculturation, and ultimately the death of Native peoples across these lands. Number 6, we need to coordinate and streamline the provision of services to Native peoples across the various state, federal, and tribal organizations and agencies tasked with serving us. To achieve these goals and to effectively redress past and ongoing injustices requires adequate, stable, and predictable funding streams, particularly in the areas of health, education, and economic development, as well as the development and implementation of policies and practices aimed at honoring the cultural and linguistic diversity of Native peoples. There's much more to say here, but I'll end on just a couple of notes. As Dr. Liebler has demonstrated in her paper, there's an ongoing need for accurate data specific to Native people. As Rodriguez, Lonbeer, and Martinez argue, data have become the new global currency and a powerful force that must be harnessed and used for good, particularly as it relates to Native peoples. And then I'll end by saying that I want to end with a clarification and a point of caution. While critically important, many of the issues that I address in my paper focus on tribes and their citizens that are formally recognized by the federal government, thereby running the risk of not fully addressing the needs and priorities of state-recognized tribes and their citizens, as well as some Alaska Native groups who are not eligible for the full range of federally funded programs and services that are currently available to federally recognized tribes. And it's also important to recognize that I've talked a lot about the federal responsibility, but a colleague of mine refers to this as a trilateral responsibility. The federal government has a trust responsibility, but it does not preclude states and tribes from assuming responsibility for American Indians and Alaska Native peoples. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists for laying out what's going on in our country in terms of the population changes, large, and the inequalities that exist. And we're now prepared for your questions. We've sped up our presentations in order to allow time for some serious interchange, since we think that's where a lot of the most important issues are actually raised. If you think about these issues, we're talking about a country that's going through a huge change, and a country, of course, which is experiencing extreme tension over these changes. A lot of our politics are about claims about them. There's dangerous separation. There's dangerous racial stereotypes and attitudes. Those are mobilized and sometimes in our politics. We are going to be a more and more multiracial society, as these projections show. Do we have the wherewithal and the understanding to think about how to actually make that work in our democracy? It's a central question. So we're ready for some questions from you. Who would like to go first? Seeing none right now, I will start it off, but I'd like you to think about this as we go along. In terms, Ryan, in terms of the changing school population, how do our choice plans that are coming along now in the country connect with this? We haven't had mandatory school desegregation since 1991, when the Supreme Court changed all the rules and began to resegregate our schools. But we have a lot of choice plans all over the country. Can you tell us what you're finding out about that, Ryan?
Thanks for the question. So charters, choice plans, in part means charter schools enables family to choose. Magnet schools is another, large way in which parents can choose. So charter school segregation is much higher than magnet school segregation. Charter school enrollment has increased substantially over the last 20 years, and magnet schools has not increased that substantially. So in a lot of ways, we have grown a sector that is more racially segregated. And seemingly, one way going forward to address some degree of segregation is to double down on the magnet school funding policy and practice that currently exist.
The interesting thing is magnet schools were substantially defunded in the 1980s, and charter schools have been substantially funded by the Congress without really much consideration of this particular issue. There's a lot of research really important about the long-term effects of these experiences. Yeah, go right ahead.
I have a question. I'm wondering what the panel has to say about schools that feel intentionally race specific, right? Where there's like a culturally specific intentionality there, how that plays into the picture, because certainly those would meet the thresholds of 90% black and brown, but perhaps it's intentionally that way in order to uplift those students, right?
I think it'd be good to hear from the panel about this, because I'm sure there's different views. And also the question is whether they're intentionally focused on a particular culture, whether they exclude people from other cultures, which is an important dimension. What would you have to say about it? Erica, why don't you start? We'll turn to you.
Sure. I think one of the challenges of macro data is not being able to go into the weeds and look at all this specifically. One of the things that we saw that was really driving suburban segregation during this period that we looked at was a dramatic increase in the opening of charter schools that were segregated. We define as segregated, so it's 90 to 100% Black and Hispanic. There were also some that were 90 to 100% white and Asian. And so certainly some of those could be like newcomer charter schools like in suburban Twin Cities, although the Twin Cities expert can correct me on that. But, so certainly we do, there could be some, and there could be reasons if the public schools don't have the curriculum, the teaching staff, that could be a really supportive role. I think the challenge is there's so many different ways charter schools can be structured to exclude students, that trying to think about that. And I think also to think about how we, though there are important benefits there are also weighed with reducing the likelihood of cross-racial exposure, for white students as well as students of color. And so those are some real tensions that I think that we have to grapple with as a community.
Susan, I'm sure you thought a lot about the importance of culture in schools, and also about both kind of. Did you hear me now? No. All right. So I was asking Susan Faircloth to talk to us about the issues of culture and Native education, both in places where there are concentrations of Native population and in places where people from tribal backgrounds are isolated in overwhelmingly Anglo schools, as many are in our big cities.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I would go back to the first question about what do we think about those schools where there's high concentrations. I think it's critically important when you look at American Indians and Alaska Natives. We have two primary systems of schooling. We have public schools, and then we have the schools that are operated and or funded by the Bureau of Indian Education and Tribes. So about 92% of Native students attend public schools. And then about 8% attend the Bureau-funded or operated schools or tribes. In those Bureau schools, you're going to see 98 to 100% of our students are Native. And that's by design. And we had an interesting discussion about that in the ride here from the hotel. It's by design. And so we have to think about that. If we didn't have those schools in place, in rural, remote, geographically isolated, reservation-based areas, where would our students attend school? And so I think that situates that conversation in a very different way than looking at your other, right, public schools. But there's also the issue of resources to those schools. We know that there are federal cases, legal cases, where schools are being sued for failure to provide free, appropriate, adequate special education services to American Indian students because they're not able to recruit and hire and retain teachers or special ed service providers. So that's an issue of resources, but also looking at if those schools weren't there, where would our students be educated? I think it's a slightly different issue when you look at public schools. I gave you the example of my daughter. My daughter is in a public school in Colorado where she's one of 3 Native students in her entire school. Now, part of that is because her father and I made a decision to move to a predominantly white area for work. But we also paid a large cost by then isolating her from Native culture and languages. And so it's critically important that the federal government provide funding for Title VI Indian education programs, which can then provide language and cultural services and supports to Native students. And it's also important to recognize those 92% of our students who attend public schools, the majority of them are in those low-density schools that I mentioned, where 25% or less of the student population is non-Native. So it's not atypical for our students to never have a Native teacher, to never see another student who looks like them or who understands their language and their culture. And then I would also point you all to the National Indian Education Study. That's the study that I chair. It is funded by the Office of Indian Education, and it's conducted in conjunction with the National Center for Ed Statistics and the Ed Testing Service. That study is the only nationally representative study of the education of American Indian and Alaska Native students. It looks at our students' reading and math performance on the National Assessment of Ed Progress in grades 4 and 8, and then there's a separate oversample of Native students to look at the presence of Native language and culture. And so we're using that study to understand the impact that Native students' access to Native language and culture can then have on their academic performance. So I would end by saying it's critically important. Too many of our students are in schools where they don't have access to Native language, Native culture, Native teachers, or administrators. But it's also equally important to recognize there is a subset of our schools that were designed specifically to educate a majority Native students.
And Gary, can I just add one other thing? What we also found in the suburbs, has been the case in urban areas, is that racially segregated schools were more likely to close. And so because we know from the harms of school closure, I think that's another thing to just keep in mind in thinking about this question.
Yes.
Susan, you mentioned a little
Could
while
you stand up?
Sure. You mentioned a little while ago the distinction between federal tribal recognition and state tribal recognition. And I know that 30 years or so ago, a lot of times in places where you had tribes that could not seek federal recognition, whether it was because of genocide or lack of record keeping or whatever, a lot of the state recognition was largely symbolic, and there wasn't really a whole lot of meaning to it in terms of public policy decisions or funding or anything like that. Over the intervening time, have you seen anything more meaningful in terms of benefit, if any, of state recognition?
That's a great question. So just to clarify that distinction, so there are currently 573 or 574 federally recognized tribal nations and Alaska Native groups. And it's important to understand American Indians and Alaska Natives are not the same, yet we get lumped together for political reasons, for funding reasons, and a whole lot of other reasons, right? And if we weren't grouped together, we were talking about some of the data that excludes us from presentation because we're considered to be statistically insignificant. You group us together, that does increase the power to be able to make recommendations. But you've got those 573, 574 federally recognized tribes, and depending on the day, anywhere from 600 to 120, I think is the number now, of state recognized tribes. My tribe, Kahari, is one of those tribes. It's one of 7 state-recognized tribes in the state of North Carolina and 1 federally recognized tribe, the Eastern Band. North Carolina, I think, is an outlier because it has a Commission of Indian Affairs that comes out of the North Carolina Department of Administration. Those 8 tribes, the 1 federally recognized, the 7 state recognized, get together. We have programs around housing, around education, around welfare, a whole host of things, and that commission is very politically active. Then you've got the National Congress for American Indians here in DC, which recently had on the table the potential of not allowing state-recognized tribes to be members, voting members of the National Congress of American Indians. That was on the ballot at the recent meeting, and it was struck down. It was not passed. So I think there's a varying degree to which state-recognized tribes have power. I think it really depends on, are they coalescing that power together and advocating on behalf of all tribes, or how are they acting together? For our tribe has been in the process of petitioning the federal government for recognition as a federally recognized tribe since 1973. So you think about that. It's 2024, and our tribe has not yet been able to gain federal recognition. But there are a host of other state tribes that have been able to do that by working together collectively to be able to demonstrate that they have a landmass, a language, a legal, political, government, and those kinds of things.
They intersect with issues like the efforts in many red states to eliminate programs on diversity, equity, inclusion that are exactly about the kinds of issues that Susan is talking about, and Erica's been talking about. How do we manage race relations if we're forbidden to talk about them, or books that are not allowed to be read? When we think about those kinds of issues and we think about what kind of a society we are, can we be colorblind in a society where everything in life is organized around racial background? Those are the kinds of issues that we need to struggle about and need to think about solutions for. So are there other questions right now, or should I? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm the Director of Research at Asian Americans Advancing Justice,
Yes.
AAJC, here in DC. And I would love to hear from the panelists how you think the data and the findings might change if you had disaggregated data on Asian Americans. And if you can't kind of speculate out, what are the challenges you have in accessing disaggregated data on Asian Americans?
We have another paper, by the way, that's on our website already about mixed race populations. There's a lot of intermarriage going on in the Asian community. So it's not only complicated in terms of subgroups, but also in terms of interracial marriages and children who are rapidly increasing in numbers. Do you want to talk about the data for subgroups, Jennifer?
I would say that there are.
Wait, Jennifer might go first.
I just want to make a quick comment because when I've worked with data from school collected data, it is not good in terms of, it's just, you're lucky if you could get an Asian PI category, which would be Asian/Pacific Islander, all mixed together. Many of our social surveys on health, on education do no better than that. Probably the best data that we can get right now on subgroups, and we know it's a very diverse group, would be the census.
When I was the special master in the San Francisco desegregation case, and we had subgroup data, we had 8 groups represented in the desegregation plan. If you look at the Chinese immigrant population is much like the Latino population, especially those who live in Chinatown. On the other hand, the settled Chinese and Japanese population in San Francisco is soaring. The Filipino population also. If you look at the Cambodians, their situation is very much like Latino situation. So yes, it's just important to have this data. It shows different results. It is a different reality, and it's hard to get. Yeah.
So I presented some statistics on the difference in the population of white and Asian together who experience poverty and compared that with a group of Black, Latino, multiracial American Indian. And there's a huge distinction there in terms of exposure to poverty. Now, if we did that in a more disaggregated sense for Asians, we would find that some Asian groups would have much higher exposure to poverty. So we should disaggregate in terms of, I think, implementing very particular policies for different groups. That said, I do think there is still a reason to look at, on average, across these major racial groups, to try to make sense of just prevailing average trends. But it shouldn't negate the focus on the fact that some recent Asian immigrants are coming from families that are experience much higher difficulty, both in the U.S. where they came from, lower educational attainment of parents, et cetera.
The Asian population overall is very highly suburbanized.
Well, and to say, in one of the graphs I showed, we grouped white and Asian students together to look at concentration. And that was, we also did it just separately for white. And it was a decision we really wrestled with because the idea was that are typically groups that are affluent and maybe have more advantages in school. But that, of course, is not true. It's not true across any of the groups, but it breaks down quite notably within the Asian population. Still not totally sure we made the right decision, but we did. But I think that's where having good data, we would probably parse that a little differently. And I think that's then a real disadvantage in trying to devise policy to help think about, well, what kind of schools are Asian students experiencing? How can we make sure that all Asian students of all subgroups have access to the best kinds of educational opportunities? And that's a really important thing.
I just want to make one other comment here, is that all of these groups that we're talking about depend on self-identity, self-identification. And so as you go from one generation to the next, beyond the immigrant generation, the chances that they're going to be continuing to identify with that origin group declines rapidly. Yeah, so we've been doing some research on this using linked census data. By the third generation, like Mexican Americans, maybe 60% are remaining as self-identifying as Mexican, and the rest of them are not. And so because of the intermarriage that's going on. So these ethnicities tend to fade over time.
Will be fixed permanently because we're in a changing society. Go right ahead. You had a question.
My question was sort of, you have one of the papers is titled "Brown at 70 and Abandoning the Dream." And I know the overarching title is about this changing population, but it feels to me like it's been largely absent a discussion of the Black population, or any sort of thinking about the redress or his legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that this sat at. And I know, like, we point to that as being like just this stable group, or maybe declining depending on the decisions you make in the demography. But I just wonder whether you see these in tension, or other, or what the implications of the sort of demographic change that you talked about is for the groups that were sort of central to the Brown decision and civil rights.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think one of the reasons we started out to look at the suburbs, because in a way it was where white people went to get away from integrating with Black students because of Brown and after. And you see a fair amount of Black suburbanization in certain metros. I think, obviously Metro Atlanta, but there are core ways in which Black students who are moving to the suburbs are moving to places that are still the same kinds of racially and economically segregated places that they may have been leaving. They may not be quite as severely segregated as they would be if they stayed in the cities, And we do some comparison with urban areas in our paper, but they're still incredibly segregated, and they're much more segregated than their other suburban peers. So in the last graph that I flashed up there in a hot second, Black students actually had the highest increase in exposure to poverty in the period that we looked at. So it's getting worse the most quickly for them. And so in some places I did emphasize Latinx students, but that's really just a matter of degree. And on many of the measures, Black students in the suburbs are just we're replicating the inequality on a greater scale. And because there's such policy fragmentation, also because many suburbs were not racially diverse when we had desegregation orders, there's not a history of it. And so you don't have either the policy history, the language, the understanding. You usually have less racially diverse administrations and faculty. So all of those are factors in the literature that would support more desegregation and equity efforts, and they're all lacking in the suburbs in ways that are going to be really harmful to try to bring about meaningful change, absence a larger effort by states or the federal government. And Gary's already mentioned some states are working against this, particularly states that have a lot of Black students. And so we really need some effort to both support the education of the leadership here, but also specific model policies and practices to help understand how to do this better in a sort of regional way. And I think the importance of regional planning, but also regional planning that doesn't unfairly take away the voice of Black residents, for example, is going to be really important to sort of structure how we do this.
One of the things we're finding in these studies, and some of which we can't present today, but also in a parallel series we're doing in California, is really disappointing and threatening data about African American opportunity. And Jennifer's finding that there'll be really no progress in Black college completion by 2050 should be an alarm bell to the country. It's a very scary situation, and we've neglected it badly. So we're a country that's got a lot of stuff that it hasn't even talked about for a long time. That's why we're here. Latinos were quite a highly integrated population in 2070, in 1970, when they were only 5% of the population. Now, by the late 1980s, they were as segregated as Blacks. So we had all of that happen with zero policy response. And it's serious. It has lifelong effects. There's more and more research that shows that it has lifelong effects on what happens to people's patterns of opportunity. So we certainly don't mean to de-emphasize the situation of African Americans. It's serious and it's neglected. And on a number of our measures, it's the worst. Indian populations, in terms of college completion and so forth, are pretty similar to African Americans. We have a lot of work to do, and we don't ever want to de-emphasize the importance of the Black issues. Yeah.
As we get more and more limited on being able to use race explicitly in terms of achieving the promise of Brown through Supreme Court cases, anti-DEI legislation, policy making, all of that, one, do you see kind of the conversation shift to talking mostly about socioeconomic diversity, and two, if that shift to a more poverty-based conversation rather than a race-based conversation, what are we really losing from the conversation in terms of like erasing the racialized history of the segregation that we have and only focusing on the economics of it?
I have a few thoughts, and I imagine Ryan does too. The work that I've done on K-12 segregation shows that in some limited places, SES can be helpful, but it also really depends on how the SES measures are constructed. Typically, what is most widely available is the free and reduced lunch measure, which is dichotomous. Estimates before the pandemic said it was about 20% inaccurate. We fortunately had a couple of years in which there was free lunch for all kids in the country. And so it's really not helpful in the last few years for really good reasons, but still not helpful. More nuanced measures, there's concern about privacy, and school districts don't want to ask for that. Census data, well, as Carolyn always says, the census is a mess. But it's the best we have sometimes. So there are both sort of methodological problems with it. Race and SES are overlap, but they also aren't completely the same. Some of my work has also shown politically, particularly in the South, where there is this deep racialized history. It's harder to build and maintain support for socioeconomic diversity in the same way, acknowledging we have this racialized history, we need to still take account of race. It's harder to keep that up. And so I think there are a lot of really important considerations for us to have. There was a recent policy by the U.S. Department of Education last year that gave $10 million for districts to voluntarily integrate on the basis of SES. Some of the people funded were already deeply racially concentrated school districts, so it'll be really important to see what happens. The magnet school program is also increasingly funding more socioeconomic diversity, although they do fund some that are racially diverse as well. And the last thing I'll just say is I think it's going to be really important for us to think about cross-sector efforts. So how can we redouble our efforts on integrating housing racially and economically when we have these really severe limitations on what schools can take account of?
That were submitted to the Supreme Court in the affirmative action case and in the school desegregation cases, you'd find a lot of social science evidence that says you can't really do it by social and economic status. It does not produce a high level of racial integration. For example, for college, you never have just one factor. You have to have educational preparation as well as the other factor. And it's just an extremely inefficient and much more expensive way to get diversity. And very few institutions have the resources to carry it out in a serious way. So when you say you're colorblind and you pretend that you can deal with it indirectly, there's not really good evidence that you can deal with it indirectly. The Supreme Court has chosen to believe that you could, or else that it's not important enough to address in its decision. The decision doesn't really, in eliminating affirmative action last summer, does not really even address it, the question of alternatives with any seriousness. But there's a lot of good data, including data that we produced and in the book that we did called Walls Around Opportunity. Okay, other questions? We've got another minute or so for questions, and we'll turn to yeah.
This question I think is more for Susan. I was thinking about what you think the role of public schools are in supporting kind of language revitalization efforts. Just thinking about kind of the painful history of language erasure done through language policy, and if you know of any good examples where that partnership has happened.
There's two different questions there. I think ask me after the briefing and I'll tell you what I think should be the purpose of public schooling. I think that it's a whole other question, right? Because I grapple with that as a mother and as a scholar and as a Native person, and I think I have different perspectives on each of those. So that's an after the briefing. I think in terms of language, there are some good examples. If you look at the work of a scholar she's now at UCLA, Terry McCarty. Terry McCarty has done years of work, particularly with the Navajo Nation, also known as Dene. So she's done lots of work with them around language shift and revitalization. And she has a couple of examples of schools on the Navajo Nation that are really like these pockets of promise, where you see Native language and culture infused throughout the curriculum and everything that the school does. So I would encourage you to look at her work. There's also been some funding that's come out of the U.S. government. It's called NAMS, but it's a Native Languages program which has funded some language nest work, not only with American Indians, Alaska Natives, but also with Native Hawaiians. And really interesting research coming out of that. I think there's also the opportunity through those Title VI programs that I mentioned earlier, which are funded through the U.S. Department of Ed, and their competitive grant funding that school districts have to apply for, and some of those programs focus on language and culture. I can give a personal example. In my entire schooling, I never had a Native teacher. My daughter has never had a Native teacher. My tribe is one of those state-recognized tribes that has had our language stolen and is now having to work to recreate and find those pieces of language. If it had not been for what was then a Title IV or Title IX Indian Ed program, I would not have had an opportunity to be exposed to Native educators and to learn about my tribe's history and our culture and to learn about other tribes. And so it's critically important that funding be allocated and appropriated for those types of programs. But I think for Native people, I would end by saying that we believe strongly, and if you read, there's the National Indian Education Study that I mentioned earlier. There's a document that goes along with that study. It's titled Setting the Context. And in that document, we lay out as a review panel why we feel that it's critically important to infuse Native language and culture into the academic curriculum, because we believe that the more rooted and grounded our Native students are in their language and culture, then the more successful that they can be academically. And we also believe strongly that if you look at the past federal Indian Ed policies up into the late 1800s, early 1900s, the motto was kill the Indian to save the man. Say that again, that was the federal education policy. Kill the Indian to save the man, and it was aimed at eradicating our Native languages, culture, spirituality, any semblance of being Native. And so now we're still feeling the vestiges of that. And I think there's a prime opportunity to be able to engage in language revitalization in our schools, but that requires the preparation, recruitment, retention, and hiring of Native teachers. And we also know that there's a shortage of Native teachers and school leaders across the nation. I'd also just want to go back to that question about race and affirmative action, and I would just plant a seed that American Indians, Alaska Natives are different in terms of race ethnicity, that we have a legal and political distinction that in some cases separates us out from the race ethnicity categories and allows for programs and services in ways that it does not for racial and ethnic groups. And so I would encourage those of you who are interested in that to look at what is that political and legal designation. And we are the only group of students in the entire United States for which the federal government has a responsibility to provide educational services other than students with disabilities who have a right under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and students who are children of people who are in the armed forces under the Department of Defense. So the federal government has a responsibility to provide education to us in ways it does not to other racial and ethnic groups. And I think that if people use data in politically smart ways and they use those definitions, it places Native people and Native students in a different light that needs to be explored.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a brief summary of this panel and to talk about some of the implications that it may have. This is a panel taking you through a lot of descriptive data about how our country is changing. We commissioned a lot of demographic work because we figure before you know what's going on, where we're heading, you can't possibly fix things. And there hasn't been a lot of thought about where we're heading except in the way of people scaring other people, saying we're replacements going on. The demographic changes that we're talking about, they're going to happen. They're already happened to a considerable extent. If you wanted them not to happen, you would have had to change policy 30 or 40 years ago. We have not had whites reproducing at their population statistically since the 1970s. We've been below the reproduction level. That's not going to change in the near future. All of our populations are aging. we kept from aging as like European societies because we've had a lot of immigration, which we're going to be talking about this afternoon. But we are a changing society, and we have to figure out how it's changing, where the inequality is rooted, how we can begin to address it. And the first stage of that, of course, is to understand it and accept the fact that we are a pluralistic society that does not, in the young generation anymore, have a majority group where everybody's going to be living and working in a multiracial setting from now on out. And it's going to become somewhat more multiracial. And it's a society that's extremely unequal economically. Compared to our peer nations, we are the most unequal rich society in the world. And that, unfortunately, as you see in the original statistics, that inequality financially is directly related to race. The two things aren't separate, they're intertwined. The people who are poor, the concentrated poverty schools are very disproportionately Black and Latino and Native American. It's not a random distribution, it's systemic. To change it, you have to have systemic solutions. You have to think about where these things are going and how they might change. Some of those answers you're going to hear discussed this afternoon. For example, on the language issue, you're going to hear about the burgeoning of dual immersion bilingual schools around the country. Nobody's being forced to do that. People want to do it. It's being created as a new possibility. There are other things that we can do like that. The University of California has adopted a policy. It's forbidden to practice affirmative action. All universities are now in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision. But they are practicing affirmative action for tribal members because tribal membership isn't a race, it's a political status. So we can think about ways to do things like that. We have to think about them because we have a Supreme Court that, in the judgment of most people who work on civil rights, is actively hostile and is blind, colorblind, but really blind in terms of these kinds of changes and what the implications are and the inequality that's rooted in race in our society. So if you think about these panels, these programs, the schools that we're seeing, both in the suburbs and nationally that were described here, we're going through a process of deepening separation by race and class that is related to every aspect of inputs to schools and every aspect of the outcomes of schooling. And it's related in a lifelong way to what happens to young people who go through that schooling. As you can see in the research that's been done by Raj Chetty and his group at Harvard and John Reardon and his group at Stanford and other leading, Rucker Johnson at Berkeley, they're showing lifetime effects that are about not just how you do on tests, but whether you go to college, whether you finish, what kind of a job you get, what your health is as an adult. These are all related to how you get started, how you get launched, what networks you get connected to. How can we think about this? We can't solve this without understanding it, number one, and then thinking about ways in which destructive trends might be altered by incentives, by requirements, by retraining, by education. For example, education of our teachers in the suburbs, who mostly are not prepared to deal with the racial change that's happening in their schools. How are they going to know what to do unless we give them support? They don't come from that kind of diverse backgrounds. They need to figure out how to operate well in it. We're going to hear a paper on that this afternoon in our next panel. So when you think about these numbers and you think about these trends, these are things that are complicated. We're in a very complex society. We can't deal with it without understanding it. We have to think about it deeply, and we have to go more deeper, for example, to look at different kinds of populations within the Asian population. And different populations, for example, within the white population. If you look at the concentrated poverty white population in Appalachia, their situation is very much like the situation of poor people in central cities in terms of their educational outcomes. So we have to think about this with some subtlety, some understanding. and some really serious attention to the innovations that have been tried, the research that's been found, what we've learned about what can produce outcomes. You're going to be hearing this afternoon about known programs that produce very high profitable outcomes in terms of cost-benefit analysis that address the dimensions of this inequality. So with that, I just say, the thing you should remember from this panel is, what's happening is knowable. We have a pretty darn good idea of what it's going to be like 25 years from now. Most of those people are already born. They're coming along. We understand trends that are pretty well established. We can't just act as if we don't know where we're going, because we more or less do know where we're going. What are we going to do about it? That's the question for the next panel. What are we going to do about it? It has not worked out well. We're in danger as a society. We're in danger of being afraid of each other, of stereotypes being activated, divisions deepening. The answer to that is understanding and then action. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patricia Gándara. I am the co-director of the Civil Rights Project, Proyecto Derechos Civiles. And it is my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. We are going to follow the same format that we did in the last panel. I'll introduce all the panelists at once. They will then move from one to the next without any break. And we will hope to have plenty of time at the end for comments, not only questions, but comments. So you don't have to have a burning question. If you have a comment about this, we'd like to hear it as well. So our first presenter is Raul Hinojosa. He's the founding director of the North American Integration and Development Center, NAID, an associate professor at UCLA in the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano and Central American Studies. Hinojosa is the author of numerous articles and books on the political economy of regional integrations, including trade, investment, migration relations between the U.S., Mexico, Latin America, and the Pacific Rim. Raul's presentation will be followed by Manuel Vázquez, who will be talking about bilingual education and America's future. Manuel Vázquez is a bilingual, bicultural Latino immigrant and managing researcher at Education Northwest. In this role, he supports districts and states in creating learning environments that promote multilingual students' academic success and pathways to multilingualism through research and technical assistance. Next follows Kimberly Young, talking about bridging social divides through racially integrated learning opportunities. Kimberly Young is a lead ethnic studies teacher at Culver City High School for 18 years. Mm-hmm. For 18 years. She's precious. And co-chair of the Social Sciences Department. Her doctoral research, which she completed at UCLA, analyzed effective ethnic studies instruction in K-12 education and centered on the work of ethnic studies classroom teachers. Jacob Faber follows Kimberly. He'll be talking about housing in the 21st century, proposing universal vouchers. Jacob is a professor at New York University, where he studies the causes and consequences of racial inequality. Much of his work focuses on the housing market, including mortgage lending, rental market discrimination, and the long-term consequences of federal government redlining. And finally, bringing up the end, is Emma Garcia, who will be talking about the costs of inaction threatening America's future. This is where we wanted to end, is on a strong note about what we must do. Emma is a research manager at the Learning Policy Institute. She works with the early childhood learning, educator quality, and equitable resources and access teams, and has extensive research experience in the fields of economics of education, education policy, and quantitative methods. Let's go ahead, Raul.
Muchas gracias. Hi, everybody. And it's definitely a great pleasure to be back here. Unfortunately, I'm flashing back to 1982, 84, where my first testimonies in Congress were of the Immigration Reform Control Acts, which are unfortunately, I'm going to have to echo a lot of that conversation because we seem to have lost a great deal of our way. I'm going to talk about the economic vitality of the United States future, especially in the next quarter century, and that the critical role of immigration in that. So this is hopefully a pretty shocking graphic. This is the demographic future of the United States. I mean, the reality of it is we are already on a glide path down towards ending replacement demographically for the United States as on its own, and that we are increasingly depending on immigration. If there's going to be any demographic growth, if there's going to be any employment labor market growth, it is fundamentally based on the fact that the United States still has a comparative advantage around the world of attracting a great deal of people. This seems to be a very strange comment to be making in the political context of the moment, but the reality of it is that without a fundamental shift in the way in which we think about the importance of immigration for a variety of reasons, not only economic growth, but obviously in terms of the capacity of immigration to provide even greater benefits through greater inclusion of immigrants and better educational opportunities for immigrants and their families, where many of the issues that we're dealing with are just going to get much more serious. So the interesting thing, this is a Congressional Budget Office. We've been running the same type of modeling, demographic and economic modeling of the CBO since many years, decades now. The reality of it is this next stage of immigration and in fact the recovery of immigration in the last couple of years actually, is now being estimated to produce over $7 trillion gift. In other words, it's not a crisis at the border as much as it is a recovery to the necessary levels of immigration, of which what we're projecting now over the next decade is a $7 trillion benefit to the U.S. economy if we're able to recover the levels of immigration that we were having just a few years ago. So this is a demographic model that we're using in parallel to the U.S. Census demographic model, which basically, what's interesting is that by the beginning of 2017, we began to have a decline in our net immigration numbers in the United States, and that this was exacerbated not only with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, but also the COVID crisis. Since then, there's been a recovery of immigration, but it basically is taking us to essentially what is considered by the Census Bureau and many other as sort of baseline growths of immigration, which are going to be required to deal with the replacement transition that I showed previously. I put on the left-hand side a slide that we were asked, since we wrote this report, we're asked to update. Let's put it in the context of what's going on right now. So we have a growth in people coming to the U.S.-Mexican border now, basically crossing to identify themselves as eligible for asylum. That's true. And just in time to basically be able to get us back onto our immigration growth path. What's interesting here is that compared to the traditional levels of immigration, which were primarily from Mexico, I did a movie called A Day Without a Mexican. You may have seen it. This is the real thing. We are actually running out of Mexicans, okay? And there's a dramatic decline now in the number of Mexicans coming across the border. Virtually all of this is now coming in a very different way. It's not even Central Americans. In fact, Central Americans are also leveling off in terms of their growth. It's mostly from other countries around the world, and specifically three, actually. Let's just be clear about what we're talking about. We're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Cuba, and we're talking about Nicaragua, three countries that we, by the way, have some of the most severe sanctions policies in the world. So, and the number of non-America's populations coming to the border is actually relatively small, even though it's garnering a great deal of attention from Chinese migrants and other coming across at the very dangerous path. But what's interesting is that they are refugees. These are people coming to present themselves. They're not running across the border to try to commit crime. They're coming to the border directly with the instructions that they've seen on TikTok on how to identify themselves to Immigration Service. Turns out many of them paid a great deal of money to do this and come from relatively interesting backgrounds that are parallel to the needs of new immigrants. Refugees have always been some of the most important economically important populations. What's interesting about these projections, however, is that the negative slide towards negative replacement is true for all demographic groups in the population except for foreign-born Hispanics. Foreign-born Hispanics are the only ones having children at a rate above replacement, and will be doing so for quite a while. And the question that we ask in our model, which we've created now as a global model, where are immigrants potentially coming from around the world? And it turns out from Latin America is one of the most important areas where we need to draw immigrants from that do have still high replacement rates from their countries of origin, which are transmitted here. We also understand that we have a problem that can be addressed through bringing in more from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially. But interestingly enough, all the other foreign-born populations will be declining in terms of their foreign-born status. Oops.
At time, Raul.
Okay, I guess I was timed out, so you're going to get to hear my recommendations in the questions and answer period.
So, with demographic change, especially with more immigration, comes, linguistic diversity as well. And so what I will share is about the opportunity to use that linguistic diversity to support bilingual education in the United States. And, if you see, the United States is becoming an increasingly multilingual country. Right now, about 67.8 million people speak a language other than English at home. And so that's about 1 out of 5 individuals in this country. And estimates from the census finds that there's about more than 350 languages, like unique languages spoken in the United States. And so that's, an incredibly rich concentration of linguistic assets. And it points to the fact that we, need to better equip students to be prepared for an increasingly multilingual country and world, really. And within our schools, we also have, a high number of multilingual students. And one group of multilingual students, which are total over 5 million, or about 10% of this entire student population, are those that are kind of identified as needing English language supports. And so it's important to point out that these students are a protected group of students, right? Who have the kind of right to receive English language development instruction and accessible core content instruction. And if you look at data and research, unfortunately, our schools aren't always historically doing well at serving this population of students. If you see things like graduation rates, nationally, the graduation rates for students that are identified as English learners is lower than those that were never identified. And how schools support these students kind of access their civil rights varies quite a bit. There's some guidance that came out of the Castañeda v. Pickard Fifth Court of Appeals ruling that talks about kind of 3 things that they need to do. They need to make sure that the way that they're supporting students' English language development and core content access is grounded in theory and research, implemented with appropriate resources, and is demonstrated to be effective over time. And so this is, some guidance, but what it looks like on the ground still varies quite a bit. And so one way that schools can support students is through bilingual programming, right? So this is when instruction is in a student's home language alongside English for a certain part of the day. And so in our paper, we look at the research behind bilingual education and how effective it is at supporting this particular group of students, multilingual students classified as English learners. And we recommend to expand these programs and both to better support these students and to also take advantage of our increasingly multilingual assets in our country. And so, like I said, our recommendation to expand bilingual programs really rests on decades of research that demonstrates that bilingual programs are the most effective ways to support multilingual students classified as English learners. So we conducted a comprehensive review of the research that examines the efficacy of different program models. And we found that the best way to support learning language and content for this group is through, like I said, using students' home language alongside English. So results from high quality research find that EL classified students who participate in bilingual education scored higher in reading and math assessments while developing proficiency in 2 languages. And in addition to boosting content learning and language, there's also evidence that these programs carry additional benefits, such as improving students' sense of belonging in school, facilitating family engagement, supporting cognitive development, and eventually helping students earn higher wages when they enter the workforce. Bilingual programs come in different flavors. Those that kind of have longer duration. So if it's instructions in a student's home language for a longer period of time in their grade projection, those tend to kind of magnify some of these benefits. While I've focused specifically on EL classified students, there's also reason to believe that these programs can support all students. So there's a recent study that came out a few weeks ago that looked at Atlanta's dual language immersion programs and participation in dual language immersion programs. And while it wasn't focused on EL classified students, half of the students in the sample were Black students. And the results from the study were really positive for students that participated in these programs. So just a way that these programs don't just benefit EL classified students, but can benefit a wider swath of students. So what do we need to do? So make sure that these programs are available for more students. So there's multiple pieces that need to be in place. I don't think we can say everybody must have dual language programs now, because that's really difficult. We don't really have the infrastructure for that right now. That'll take a little bit longer, and we talk about some of that in the report, what needs to happen at the different levels. Here I'll focus just on kind of one piece of the puzzle, and it's more focused on what Congress can do, and on one issue, which is expanding the pipeline of multilingual educators who are needed to support students in these classrooms. So at the federal level, like the education department can start by setting the tone and providing guidance, non-binding guidance that identifies these types of programs are the optimal way to meet students' core rights. This guidance can change minds at the state and local level to rethink the way that they're supporting EL classified students. More concretely, Congress can increase funding for Title III, which is funding streams from the federal government that supports EL classified students. And a recent report by the Century Foundation, whose author is here, if you want to ask more, pointed out that Title III funds haven't really changed in many years. And so additional funding to states could be used to support professional development for teachers to work in bilingual environments. And kind of relatedly, there's going to be additional grant funding that targets multilingual educator pipelines. And just yesterday, there was actually a call for grants that came out through the National Professional Development Program that focuses on increasing the pipeline of multilingual education. So that's great. I think the current department is doing great, but it's too little. So the recommendation stands.
Thank you. We'll return to this. I do want to inject one thing. Research that we've done at the Civil Rights Project also shows that for Latino students, mostly because that's the group that gets studied the most because it's the most prevalent language, but for Latino students, they're more likely, if they're able to maintain their home language along with English, they're more likely to go to college. And that's a real big deal for students of color in this country.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, someone's going to have to cue me to keep going. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Young, and I am a high school teacher. Believe me, this is not what my typical Wednesday afternoon looks like in any way, shape, or form, but my students are very excited that I'm here with you today. So I've been a teacher for 18 years. I taught for 10 years in Oakland Unified, and for the last 8 years, I've been in Culver City Unified School District. And I teach ethnic studies, and a course you may have heard something about. It's called AP African American Studies. So I say all of this because I spend my entire day really thinking about race and teaching about race and talking about race specifically in school. And just for some context, when we began writing our paper, it was the summer of 2020. It was the outset of the racial reckoning in the United States. People were literally marching in the streets. Those times feel very different from this moment that we're in right now. And ultimately, unfortunately, like very little was actually reckoned with racially in our society, even though we were in such a promising moment. So in our paper, myself, along with Sunil Kaluri, Leanna Hippolyte, and Alexis Patterson, we identified schools as being that central institution for racial reconciliation. And we looked at 5 decades worth of research and data and court cases to really try to make the argument that when we consider race, it helps racially minoritized groups, and ignoring race harms them. In our paper, we make a plethora of different policy suggestions to push states, to push districts, to push schools to consider race in enrollment, in classroom teaching, and then in the curriculum as well. So in the United States, there's been this long-held belief that racial outcomes will somehow equalize just through the mere passage of time. But unfortunately, the data does not show this to be true. We know that the racial wealth gap is large and it may be growing. A lot of the data that you've seen presented here also really kind of sets the context that we have to do things proactively right now in order to ensure that we can start to close different gaps that exist in our society today. So this is the context that we're writing our paper within, because we would like the government to proactively consider race again in schools. We know that considering race leads to meaningful gains in liberty and in justice for racially minoritized communities. So bear with me, I'm a history teacher. We're gonna start with school enrollment really quickly. 1954, Brown v. Board. This is the historic court case that leads to the requirements that state and local education boards must consider race in school enrollment. UC Berkeley professor Rutger Johnson does the work of analyzing the outcomes of those racial considerations, finding huge gains for Black students exposed to racial integration. One of those gains is on the screen there. Really what this is showing us, the graph is showing us, is that the more years that Black students are exposed to integrated schools, the more years of education they complete. The same was not true for white students. So considering race and education in this way is working to close that racial gap. So then what happens? Well, truthfully, we stop considering race in school enrollment. The Supreme Court, in multiple cases, essentially bans explicitly considering race in school enrollment. And today, Black and Latinx students are as segregated as they were before Brown v. Board. So then what does this mean? When we do not consider race, racially minoritized groups are significantly impacted. But if we move from just enrollment now into the actual classroom, integration by itself has unfortunately never been enough to overcome some of the entrenched racial inequalities that exist in our schools. Fast forward to the 1970s. Stanford professor Elizabeth Cohen spent a lot of time researching student interactions in these integrated schools. Various studies, she researches interactions between white and Black students engaging in group work. And she's noticing that white students are controlling the small group discussions. In one study, 14 out of 19 groups had a white participant as the most active member of the group. In later research, when students are first shown a video of Black students being able to successfully perform a relevant task, that outcome shifts, and Black students are now participating just as much as their white peers. Considering race eliminates gaps in student performance. And if we don't pay attention to considering race in the classroom, white students engage more often in mixed group settings than Black students, potentially reproducing these existing gaps that we know are happening right now in classrooms. Now, unfortunately, these experimental research designs from the 1970s, few teachers are actually trained to consider race in student interactions in the classroom, which harms students of color. Today, many students are directly considering race through the curriculum. I teach in California. California is going to have, in just a few years, an ethnic studies requirement. Ethnic studies classes are expanding rapidly across the country, expanding educational opportunities for racially minoritized students. In San Francisco, Stanford researchers Dee and Penner published a study that really analyzed ethnic studies program, and the students that were enrolled in ethnic studies programs at the time in San Francisco Unified were students that all had below a 2.0 GPA. Their findings are remarkable, right? These students, they over 1 point boost in their GPA. They're also their attendance increased by more than 21 percentage points, and they are earning more credits towards graduation. Other studies have demonstrated association between ethnic studies participation and demographic engagement on issues of racial justice and social justice. So considering race has a substantial benefit both academically and politically for our most marginalized students. But unfortunately, there are many, many strong forces that are at play resisting efforts to consider race in the curriculum. We have states like Florida and elsewhere throughout our nation that we know are actively trying to make it so that you can't talk about race in the classroom. The objective of our paper is for us here today to really push for policies that consider race in education, explicitly talking about race in education. As research consistently shows, considering race in education helps equalize racial outcomes. And as a teacher trying to do this work in my classroom every day, it is essential that we have policies that administrators, teachers, and students are able to gain open access to consider race in our schools to address these persistent educational gaps that hinder our most marginalized students.
Thank you. Thanks. I don't have any slides. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. My name is Jacob Faber, and I'm a professor at New York University and a scholar of racial inequality and segregation. I was recently asked by a reporter to imagine what America would look like if we were without any affordable housing. And I told them that sadly, we don't have to imagine that scenario as we are already kind of there. On the rental side, there isn't a state in the country where a 40-hour work week at minimum wage can afford a home, a two-bedroom home. And in most of the country, 2 people working at 40 hours a week at minimum wage can't afford a two-bedroom home. And on the homeownership side, home prices and rising inequality have pushed the pursuit of homeownership completely out of reach for many families. And of course, as many people have highlighted today, the reality is far more severe for people of color because of a history of exclusion and contemporary practices which do little to address that history. Decades after the civil rights era, we still largely live in segregated neighborhoods, and racial inequalities, as Kimberly just mentioned, in wealth are greater today than they were in 1980. So, addressing inequality in housing is undeniably a daunting task. There's no single silver bullet that will solve all the problems, but given the immediacy of America's affordability crisis, one meaningful policy change would be establishing a universal and empowered voucher program. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, occasionally referred to as Section 8, is the largest rental housing assistance program, helping over 2 million households in America. funds are distributed from the Department of Housing and Urban Development through local public housing authorities and then to landlords. Recipients have to have incomes below 80% of the area median income and are required to pay 30% of their income towards rent, and then the voucher makes up the difference there. And there is strong evidence that this program has a wide range of positive benefits on families, such as improved residential stability, increased child academic performance, and reduced poverty. But unfortunately, fewer than 1 in 4 eligible households receive a voucher because of funding gaps, and the average family spends around 2.5 years on a wait list for a voucher if they live in a place where the wait list is open. So the first thing that must be done is to fully fund the program such that all eligible families can secure a voucher. Another important challenge with the program is that recipients tend to rent in racially and economically isolated neighborhoods, which leads to concerns about whether the program reinforces patterns of racial segregation and concentrated poverty. So what I'm proposing is a policy infrastructure that needs to be built up around the voucher program to empower HUD, PHAs, and most importantly, voucher recipients to get the full benefit of every dollar spent. This requires combating discrimination, educating participants, and addressing housing supply issues. So first on discrimination, research has documented pervasive bias against renters who attempt to use vouchers. For example, research of mine conducted across 31 cities found that voucher recipients are 20% less likely to receive a positive response from an apartment inquiry. And because voucher holders are not a protected class, this discrimination is completely legal in much of the country. And while many states and cities have passed so-called source of income anti-discrimination laws, the research shows that they've had a mixed effect at best. Therefore, I argue we need to take a more proactive approach to combating bias in the rental market by, 1, funding fair housing organizations, local municipalities, and researchers to conduct regular housing audits, and 2, requiring landlords and real estate agents to submit information on their clients similar to what banks are required to report on mortgage applicants under the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA. HMDA was passed to shed light on an industry with a long history of discrimination, and we can do the same in the rental market. In fact, the New York State Senate has been trying to pass legislation similar to this since 2021. Next, on education, the aforementioned reporting requirements could be paired with an effort to engage landlords who avoid voucher holders not because of bias, but because they fear the program's requirements are too burdensome. And similarly, PHAs can work closely with voucher holders throughout the process to ensure that they know their rights and their options. There was a study conducted in Seattle recently that showed that search assistance and landlord engagement significantly increased the likelihood that voucher recipients move to high opportunity neighborhoods. Finally, on housing supply, this is admittedly the most challenging piece because of how much authority we grant local municipalities to make land use decisions, and the history of these decisions has often been one of exclusion. For example, wealthy suburbs often only allow low-density housing construction, which limits supply, increases housing prices, and blocks the construction of affordable rental housing. Thus, it becomes impossible for any households with a voucher qualifying income to afford any units in these municipalities. Therefore, efforts to increase housing supply for voucher holders must adopt a metropolitan approach, which involves constructing affordable housing in communities that have long resisted its presence. Supply concerns are further complicated by political opposition to building housing for low-income or even middle-income households, especially in these wealthy white enclaves. Because of this, it's difficult to see a solution that doesn't involve the federal government. Former HUD Secretary George Romney's proposal to allow the federal government to override exclusionary zoning is one model for this policy. So before concluding, I just want to thank you all again for the privilege to share these ideas and to acknowledge that implementing them will undoubtedly be difficult. However, if we don't act boldly now, we're looking at a future in which our housing crisis spirals further out of control with fewer opportunities to accumulate wealth and far more instability. The current and future crises offer a tremendous opportunity as well as a call to action, which, if answered, would have wide-ranging positive benefits for many Americans. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present today and for the amazing privilege to contribute to this project, which looks forward, but building on the extraordinary contributions of many before us. I'm Emma Garcia. I'm a research manager at the Learning Policy Institute, and I'm presenting joint work with Columbia University professor and LPI senior fellow Henry Levin. Definitely, all the presentations before mine have invited lots of questions for those of you in the audience in charge of designing our policies ahead. As we reflect on all those ideas, my presentation is going to discuss the potential benefits of developing an agenda that is focused on improving education for students of color and for students from low-income families. So our study gathers evidence on the societal returns brought by interventions that are equity-centered. That means interventions that aim at improving opportunities to learn and outcomes for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. We examined these interventions in multiple areas, including enrollment and completion in early childhood education, secondary education, higher education, school integration, as well as accelerated or comprehensive curriculum programs, which include community schools or socio-emotional interventions. We show that not only are these interventions effective and equitable, meaning that they help reduce racial and income-based gaps, but they also have large returns to society that are very substantial. We know this from benefit cost analysis or economic evaluations that monetize the impacts of the interventions. This is a method long used in other fields, from environment to transportation, and increasingly used in education policy. For example, the 2023 economic report of the president did rely on several of these economic evaluations, and Orfield's latest book, which he referred to before, also makes a case, a very persuasive case, on the simplicity and the value of using cost-benefit analysis. The benefit cost analysis results show that returns to education programs in these areas generally range from about $2 to $13 per dollar invested. So this is important because the US is at a moment in which the demographic changes ahead present an opportunity to activate the potential of the growing majorities, after decades of noticing the large and persistent gaps by race, ethnicity, and income in both opportunities and outcomes. We have seen already some of these population projections, but let me summarize them one more time since I'm the last presenter. Between now and 2060, there will be a 64 million increase in the population of color, a 33 million decline in the white population, and an 8 million decline in the school-age population, which in this case is a 0-17 age group. To state what might seem obvious, and probably is obvious to all of us here, the economic and social outcomes for the US as a whole will reflect the opportunities to learn and the outcomes of the growing majorities. This underscores the need to enact an agenda at scale that improves education for students of color and outcomes for adults of color. This agenda at scale could actually lead to gains that could be very substantial. To illustrate this, in the paper, we offer simulated gains to society to improving education for Blacks and Hispanics. Selecting just 3 interventions from the list earlier, we can see the benefit to cost ratios and the net benefits per participants of attending high-quality EC, graduating from high school, and completing an associate's degree. They range from about $3 to $13 per dollar invested for the ratios, and from $187,000 to $300,000 for the net benefits per participant. So the exercise is as follows. If in a given youth group, Black and Hispanic children and youth enrolled in ECE graduated from high school and completed their associate's degree at the same levels as whites, just from those three age groups, we could expect an increased net benefit to the general public of around $70 billion per year. Our study stresses the value of economic analysis as a way to show that failure to improve outcomes for students of color to invest on our growing majorities is projected to have societal costs. In addition, results from benefit cost analysis are an important element for policymakers to consider. While they have some limitations, these studies do help us see that the returns vary depending on the length during which the costs and the benefits are measured, the intensity of the interventions, the inclusion of effects and outcomes with larger economic consequences such as health or incarceration, as well as the scale at which the interventions are provided. There can be a gap in time between when the costs are faced and when the benefits materialize. Statistically, that's taken care of, but that's a very important element in policy considerations because some generations may only see the costs. Something that we cannot emphasize enough is that all groups benefit. There is nowhere in this literature, in all this evidence that shows that non-targeted groups see their trajectories harmed in any ways. The existing evidence shows that improving human capital of any group results in increased benefits for all. Finally, all the historical knowledge and the evidence from the present point to a need to advance an agenda that provides equal educational opportunities and that also balances returns across groups. Some can be accomplished through education, but others may need broader interventions, including healthcare, childcare, housing, social services, and also broader economic policies. So long so many things continue to be non-race or non-social class neutral or operate in a discriminatory way in our societies. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions.
Hi, I'm Jessica Stamp, and I'm a PhD student at Howard University. Had a quick question for you. You had mentioned a study that was conducted that showed that the programs that were created for Hispanic students were also serving students of different demographics. Do you mind sharing what that study was so I can note it?
Yeah. I'd start by saying that, in these programs, specifically dual language immersion programs, some models of these place both, monolingual students, so students that might only know English, along with students that are multilingual and developing their English, right? And so both of these students are in this same group. And so this study was by Camila Morales. I forget the exact title, but it's in the Education Evaluation Policy Analysis Journal, EPA. Mm-hmm.
I'll just add on to that, too, that at the Civil Rights Project, we've, for quite some time now, been pushing the idea of dual language programs, immersion programs, as a way to get around the prohibition on using race, instead using language. And we particularly wanted to focus on African American students being mixed with students of different languages so that we can use that as another way in to try and desegregate some of our most segregated schools. If there are no other questions or comments right now, I have some questions.
I'll come up here.
Oh, good.
Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Lynn Martin. I am the Housing Policy Counsel at PRAC, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. And I know a few of your names from different publications and such. My question's for Jacob about the proposal of universal vouchers. we have been seeing a large increase in the number of states that are actively trying to preempt source of income discrimination. Kentucky just passed and went into effect in this past month. Idaho and Missouri are both also have pending bills. Texas has been preempted for a while, basically saying no municipality or locality in the state can pass protections for voucher holders. So I'm curious how that plays into your, vision and proposal for the future.
It's a great question, and that's something that we've seen as well. In fact, during this study, I think it was Pennsylvania passed one of those laws turning Pittsburgh from protected to not. Maybe the good news is that it doesn't seem like those laws have much of an effect on reducing discrimination. That said, that doesn't mean that they can't. So, I'm not going to say that preempting those laws is neutral. If anything, it at least kind of sends a signal to the market that is probably positive. And the solution to this, I think, is twofold. One, there has to be a national protection of source of income, which could cover well beyond just housing choice voucher recipients, but and many of these state and local policies also support other beneficiaries of various social welfare programs. And the other thing I will say again is that these anti-discrimination laws, and one of the reasons why they're not as effective is that they're structured to create opportunities for prosecution, right? And prosecution is very long and extremely expensive, and not something that your average voucher recipient is going to be able to invest time and money in. Furthermore, one of the things that we found in our research was that in places where voucher discrimination was illegal, landlords they didn't discriminate less, but they hid their discrimination better. So rather than saying like, no, we don't take voucher recipients, they just didn't reply. And so rooting out that kind of discrimination via these source of income discrimination policies is extremely hard, if not impossible. Because if you're a recipient that doesn't get an email back, it's impossible to know whether or not you were discriminated against that, which is why we need this kind of more proactive approach in which people are required to report data to essentially prove that they don't discriminate, rather than having the burden of proof on the victims of discrimination.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josiah St. Julian. I'm a research associate with the Legal Defense Fund. And I actually have two separate questions for two of the panelists. So if we don't have time to get to both of them, that's okay. But Kimberly, one question that I had was about if you had some insights into the mechanisms that, I guess, explain why Black students are shown to perhaps have positive educational outcomes when they are exposed to more racially integrated schools, just based on some of the studies that you referenced. And then Raul, I had a question about, I guess, a concern maybe that I have about the extent to which immigration or immigrant workers are sometimes utilized as an underclass, if you will, like ethnicity and class kind of being commingled. And so I guess I'm a little worried about to what extent do we have policy protections to ensure that if we are to have more inclusive immigration policies, that they don't exploit individuals who come to the country, and don't have that very clear stigmatizing and class reifying element to it.
Would you like to respond and then I'll respond?
If you want, I can go first. I mean, it's a very, very important point, and I think it has to do with a lot of misconceptions about both immigration and what immigration policy will do. Obviously, immigration reform, all our projections of immigration reform, starting with the evidence we have of IRCA, is that it's extremely positive in terms of lifting from an economic inequality point of view, folks. And it's interesting because, I mean, our projections now is that if we legalize the existing DACA, DAPA, and undocumented population, we generate about over $2.2 trillion in economic growth, but most of that comes from growth in the ability of immigrants to move, to better fit in their human capital to the needs, and that the other really important element of it is what we saw at that time is a investment in their own human capital. So it actually what keeps the quote underclass is in fact our designed to be broken immigration system, which knows absolutely that we are bringing in all of the workers that we need to feed ourselves as undocumented for the most part, and rely on that subsidy to the corporation. So, with the fascinating, approach here is not only legalization, but increasingly as we move forward into the 21st century, we're going to need a wide range of skills levels. So the interesting thing is that most immigrants from different parts of the world are coming with a plethora of skills. We do need to make sure that we actually upgrade those skills in a variety of ways. I just wanted to mention there's a number of things going on that I think are going to be important. For example, the environmental investments which are about to occur, and the Justice 40, which hasn't been mentioned here. I mean, that is a very interesting set of policies that have to be focused. 40% of these trillion of resources has to be focused in communities, so-called disadvantaged communities. So that's one way that we've now broken into direct inequality policies. And they turn out to be mostly, by the way, not only communities of color, but immigrant communities are in those Justice 40 communities.
And so to get back to your first question, one of the things that is top of mind for me is just the access to resources that the schools, these integrated schools, really had. I think that that's really important. It's one of those things that, schools take so many resources for students to do well in them. I'm thinking specifically of Elizabeth Cohen's work, and while she was there watching kind of classrooms and noting talk and who is talking, but with small kind of interventions, Black students specifically were really able to see themselves in a new way and really push into conversations in really important ways as action takers in these interracial spaces. But the schools themselves were resourced, and that's one thing that's really important when we're kind of thinking about what this looks like moving forward.
I have a question, Emma. I actually worked in the legislature in California for a few years, and one of my great frustrations was that we would produce good cost-benefit analyses, but there's a difficulty in getting people to invest in something before they can see the outcome. And particularly if they envision that they may not be there when that outcome happens. So I wonder how you think about how we use the good cost-benefit analyses that we have in a way that is more effective in getting people to buy in early on.
Yeah, that's a very critical point in a way. And it might be more a question for the policymakers than for us, the researchers. What I want to stress is that two things, I'll say. One, that we need to understand the work cost in the cost-benefit analysis more as an investment than as an actual cost, so that people are not so scared away from the amount of money that is required to implement and sustain good programs. And the second part is that it's in the understanding of the distribution of both the costs and the benefits, where perhaps we can find some room for understanding and for transferring and for accommodating. Another thing is that it's in the numbers in a way, so it should be transparent. It's a transparent method. It's a complex method, especially when you want to compare the use of cost-benefit analysis in housing or for vouchers or for schools integration or for other programs or for early childhood education. But it's in the numbers. So it's a matter of really looking at the costs as investments that we need to sustain to support the gains and the benefits of our society entirely and for the future.
That was a great response. Jacob, I have a question for you too. Those of us in education see housing policy and education as being very tightly related to each other. In particular, because one of the things that we know from education research is that students who don't have stable housing tend to move a lot. And they go from school to school to school, and that is just disastrous for their educations. Can you say a few words about why it is so critical that we do what you're suggesting to save the kids from an interrupted education?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, and I'm not an education scholar, but from what I know from the literature is that there's overwhelming evidence, as you said, that when kids move, it's disruptive for them for many reasons. It's stressful. They have to learn a whole new system, often a whole new sort of social network, and so providing for residential, not only kind of residential stability, but residential stability in well-resourced school districts is really a critical benefit of kind of making this investment, if we're going to use this language. At the same time, I'm glad you kind of brought up this connection between housing and education, because of the fact that we're the only nation among peers that has the barbaric practice of funding local schools with property taxes. And because of that, we've created this enormous incentive for the wealthy to segregate. That has a way of kind of complicating, I think, some of the kind of cost-benefit analysis, as well as the kind of politics of the cost-benefit analysis, in that, if you look at kind of aggregate groups, it's true that there's a kind of net societal benefit to many of these investments, to reducing inequality, et cetera. But there are people who benefit tremendously from inequality and from segregation. Schooling and school finance is the clearest example, that the hoarding of resources by wealthy school districts, overwhelmingly white and suburban and homeowners. There's a tremendous amount of research from Ann Owens and Junia Howell and many others showing that in more segregated places, wealthy white students do better. And so, if we reduce that inequality and we reduce that segregation, those students might not benefit from that in the same way. And I think it's really critical to highlight this point because it also reaches into the way that we have highly segregated home equity accumulation. We have highly segregated the citing of environmental hazards. We are kind of increasingly asking municipalities to kind of rely on penalizing fines and fees related to kind of criminal justice and safety in a highly segregated and racialized manner. And so there's an intentionality behind the inequality and segregation that we see that really complicates this politics because those kind of same vested interests are the people who are fighting against the investments that we need to make in these kind of marginalized communities, because they will have to give up kind of power and resources for there to be a more equal society.
Whoa. A lot of the research that has been done by the Civil Rights Project and others has shown that when integration is planned carefully, that white students don't lose out. That it can be done in such a way that it doesn't pit one against the other. So I think there's a lot of nuance into this question. Anybody else have a burning question while we're going? I have lots. Okay.
Hi, my name is Paige Shoemaker-DeMille. I'm with the Center for American Progress, and my question specifically for Manuel. So I know that you briefly touched on Title III funds and how they are used. I also know that in the House there have been proposals to eliminate Title III funding. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about what impact that decision would have if it were made on the over 5 million students who need these supports, kind of the gravity of that impact, and as well as the capacity that states would have to be able to support those students if they did not have the federal funding.
Let's start by saying that most funding for students come from the local level in the states. I think like the amount of Title III funding per student is like $170 some, something closer to that. So there would still be like services for students, but it's still a critical piece in serving the students who are already limited in the funding that they receive. So I think it would have like a really bad effect in their ability to access teachers that are prepared to instruct them. It would. The way that the funding for Title III right now is structured already limits the ability for dual language programs or bilingual programs to be used. So that would even limit it even more. So it would really be counter to this kind of idea of expanding bilingual options for students and really kind of like taking away this opportunity that has shown that is very beneficial. So those are some of the negative consequences. And, it would... I'm not completely familiar with the language in the bill, but it also goes against, the civil rights of these students, which is to have access to English language supports and access to core content instruction. So, overall, it's just be, a very bad outcome for students who are already underserved.
Kimberly. Sure. You cited the work of Thomas Dee at Stanford. He's also done some really important work on the effects of having teachers of color for students of color. Could you say a few words about that and what we can do in terms of policies that would allow us to attract more teachers of color into the field?
Yeah, I think that that's really important it feels like it's all over the news that teachers are exiting the classrooms in droves, but students will continue to show up, and we will need adults, well-prepared adults, to meet those needs and meet their needs. So it's really important that we not only have teachers, we have qualified teachers, and that we have teachers representative of the populations that they are teaching. One thing that I think is really important is that we start opening up new pipelines to bring teachers into the classrooms. As a part of my work in Oakland Unified, we had a parent coordinator who was there at the school site, and one of the things that we were kind of noticing is that we weren't really leveraging the parent power that we had on our campus. Essentially her job was to really bring these parents into their own children's educations in all of these really important and beautiful ways. So I think that there's multi-tiered levels of which we can do this. At the high school level, I can almost see the students that I know would go into the field of education or would be really good in the field of education, and encouraging them. And when you talk to teenagers and you ask them, you ever thought of being a teacher? They will say no and laugh, right? Because they see how their peers behave in classrooms often. But that doesn't mean that with a little bit of incentivizing them, that they wouldn't really decide to take on a career path that would include education in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's really important. One thing that we could also do, this speaks to my personal educational soul, is we can re-envision what school looks like, right? We have a lot of struggles with schools and with students coming back into schools, not wanting to come back into schools after the pandemic because they don't feel safe in schools. And we have a lot of adults adults talking about safe spaces and all of these things, but we really need to center the needs and the voices of students themselves, right? Teenagers can speak for themselves. And so how are schools and school districts being responsive to the needs of the teenagers that we are trying to serve? I think that's a really important and kind of underutilized data source for us to think about as we build pipelines and pathways and new means to recruit teachers from the surrounding communities into the classroom. I've always been very fortunate to live in the neighborhoods that I teach, but I'm an outlier in that way. And I have no doubt that that's one of the reasons why I've been able to maintain being in the classroom for so long. I was joking that I have like the best commute in LA. It's 6-minute walk from my front door to my classroom door. If I forget something, I can make it in 4 minutes. But I am really, really an outlier in that. And so unless we are going to pay teachers the work that we actually do, and also be respectful of the field and understand that many, many teachers are experts on our own craft, and should be respected as professionals, it's going to be a really hard field to bring people into. I guess the answer is twofold. One, open new pipelines in order to get get people into classrooms, into teacher training, but also like we have to shift the narrative about what it means to be a teacher and be respectful of the work and the sacrifice and dedication while we're doing all of these things.
Thank you for that. I had to ask that question because Kimberly and I were designing our own perfect solution to this last night, but it was costly. Manuel, can you tell us where there are some particularly good examples of the kind of bilingual dual language instruction? Are there states that are better at this than others?
Yeah, so there's some states that have specific policies that facilitate this process. Like Texas, for example, has a policy that that mandates programs to be implemented at schools if the number of students cross a certain threshold. Utah has like a really expansive bilingual program. I come from Oregon, so I'm most familiar with the Northwest. Washington State just came out with like a new vision for dual language programs for all, which is more of an aspirational vision, but they are putting money behind it in trying to increase the pipeline of new dual language programs. In Oregon, there was just a policy passed that changed the definition of the graduation requirements for high school from English language arts to just language arts. And so that's policy shift also provides an opportunity for new courses to count towards that are in a different language. So those are just, I think, some examples of like things states are doing that can both support current programs and lay the future down for future ones as well.
Maddie.
Hello, my name's Maddie Jeshu, and I work on behalf of a bunch of different organizations, but one of the organizations I work for is Sandy Hook Promise, and with them I do a lot of school safety and student mental health work, but within the school safety piece in particular, we get into a lot of conversations around hardening of schools and the ways in which schools are more carceral settings than they've really ever been. I am wondering, as we're talking about civil rights and education and the student experience and how schools can and should change, what thoughts you might have around how all of those things mesh together, the segregation we've been talking about, and this hardening piece.
It's a really important question. Thank you for that question. Yes, schools are hardening. And also the policies feel very inflexible for a lot of teenagers. We have a student at our school who's really like an advocate of mental health, and just watching some of the barriers that she has come up against just at I'm at a district that has one high school, and getting things to move and to change is really, really hard with these kind of entrenched systems with large comprehensive high schools. So it is it is not without hope, but it is like we have to be clear about like the realities that schools kind of exist within, right? So you'll have on one side people really wanting schools to be safe. I mean, I am the mother of an 8th grader and a 4th grader as well, and I know that for my 4th grader, he's never known a life without lockdown drills, and he's at a school that was very, very close to a gun store, so they had to go in lockdown drills pretty often for many different reasons. But that's one of the things, like how do we keep kids safe, but also how can we build policies that are responsive to the needs of teenagers as they kind of shift and grow and change. I wish I had a really good like policy idea for you. One thing that I know that my district is really trying to move in towards the direction of are just restorative justice practices, bringing that into the classroom, making sure that teachers and security and like all levels of what it looks like in a school site are trained. We have similar language and we have kind of similar response mechanisms when students, when they act out in some way, or when students need support in different ways. But yes, I mean, the hardening of schools, that very much feels almost like it's contextualized to the local levels as well, and to what, like, school boards are really important, and kind of messaging that are being presented by school board members in public spheres, it's something that also needs to be kind of examined and looked at.
I had one more question for Kimberly. So I think there's consensus, I think, that educational interventions can be more impactful when they are implemented at like lower ages or lower educational levels. So when thinking about like ethnic studies and teaching youth about race, from your experience, is that something that is easier to implement policy-wise and politically speaking for younger students, or is that something that's perhaps more politically expedient, like targeting high schoolers? And how would one try to maybe make it so that elementary school kids could have it, or maybe it's not possible politically? I don't know. So
that's a great question. Okay. I was like, is it possible? Everything's possible. We can redesign anything. People build systems. People can redesign systems. That is like the going mantra in my classroom. I think one thing that's really important is that if we don't do something until high school, students often feel like they've been lied to. And that is not a feeling that is helpful for a democracy. So it may look different in different situations. I had the privilege of teaching an ethnic studies course to elementary school teachers and teacher education at UC Riverside. And it was really interesting to listen to, young in-service teachers talk about like, oh, the curriculum doesn't have any bias. I'm like, wait a minute. So then it's like unpacking what it looks like how are we building these like identities about ourselves? What are kids talking about on the playground with one another? How do we interrupt this in a really young stage that's developmentally appropriate for them as elementary school students, but also leads you on this path of more criticality? And I think that this is really an important thing to think about, especially in the district that I'm in. We've had many teachers kind of come to the ethnic studies department and ask like, well, what would this look like in a TK setting? I'm like, okay. But there's definitely want, and parents are also like, we don't want to wait for our students to get into high school before they have conversations about race. Because I don't know if any of you have ever seen a middle school campus, but believe me, students are talking about race in ways that are, can be dangerous sometimes. So it is really important that we push in and have some of these conversations that might feel a little bit more risky earlier on. And one thing, I was joking at the time, but with my students at UC Riverside, as I was like, friends, Sesame Street got woke. Like Sesame Street, there's a lot of resources out there for talking to really young students, really young children, even before you get to TK, about race and about racial difference and about community and coming together and being a collective. So there are resources out there.
Thank you. So oh yes, go ahead. And then that's going to be followed by Raul, who we cut off.
Thank you so much. I'm Jenna Tomasello with the National Coalition on School Diversity. Great to have everybody here.
So I mostly do communications for the coalition, and I couldn't agree with you more, Kimberly, that, we've intentionally built what we have and we can rebuild it. So I guess, really my question is, taking all of this in, what would it really take to change this zero-sum narrative that we have in education and housing? Like, what real level of investment would it take so that it's not like we're taking from one group and giving it to another? What policies, what research? I feel like the Civil Rights Project has, been at this for so long. We have so many smart people in this room who have done the research, who have come up with the policies. We don't have the public and political will to make this civil rights agenda a reality. So I'm just curious from anyone on the panel, like, what will it really take to do that? Because I really feel like that's what's holding us back. And, real or perceived, this idea, this zero-sum narrative that we have in our country writ large, outside of education, outside of housing, is so damaging. And I really think it's holding all of us back. So would just love folks' thoughts on that.
I'll just say
Thank you for a great question, by the way.
Yes, that's a great question. I'll just say one thing, and I'll pass it to the rest of my fellow panelists. To stress the value and the potential of diversity. Typically, we tend to separate, to just look at the effects on one group, ignoring the externalities or the social impacts or the benefits to others. There's nowhere in the housing, in the early childhood literature, there are lots of references that will stress that nobody gets harmed in a diversified setup. So instead of putting us in a confrontational or separation setup, we should see the value and the power and the potential of diversity.
Well, I want to respond, yes, to that exact question was the last thing I wanted to end on. Maybe, I don't know if you had your question that you wanted to ask me, but in many...
I just wanted to give you the floor because we cut you off on time and we were all sitting here wondering what were his policy suggestions.
Well, exactly where I wanted to end is your comment. Even though I agree with you that, we have a barbaric system of income inequality, in this country. Where do we go forward? I mean, that's the interesting question. If we can, we have the ability to reimagine and to measure the actual impact of diversity and equity, which we don't do, by the way. We don't do it, but there are ways to do that. One, I've been doing it for many years. I want to get a little wonky. Go to the Congressional Budget Office. Figure out how the methodology that they use to actually, where did they come up with that $7 trillion number of immigration? It turns out they use something called a computable general equilibrium model. All right, so that means it's not just one area where you're looking into, but you're looking into the multiplier effects throughout an entire economy. That's what we have to do. And it's a little difficult, but it can be done. And the Congressional Budget Office does it, all right? It's framework already built in to the way that they do things. So for example, immigration and immigration policy, what we do, we look at, what we're really doing when we have immigration reform, or in many ways, these educational reforms that we're talking about, we're unleashing human capital. We're unleashing an ability that human beings have to generate an incredible amount more value in many ways, and by in many cases, just taking away barriers. So immigration is a perfect example of how we got to how do we get to these $2 trillion in economic benefits? As people become documented, they have the ability to then exercise their not only moving labor in the labor market, but investing in their own education and investing in their kids' education. And this is why I stress financial inclusion as a part of that. That generates its own value, which is not only affects those immigrants, it affects the entire economy. We did a book called The Trump Paradox, which it looks at why, people, who is really the anti-immigrant base of the MAGA movement. It turns out it's all these districts around the country where there is no immigration, but they have the most negative attitudes about immigration. They have the most negative trade attitudes. There's no trade here. However, you look at, well, what is the impact of policies, both anti-immigrant policies like these mass deportations people are talking about, or potentially legalization. And it turns out when you do and you look at these multiplier effects and these general equilibrium effects, it's exactly these types of communities that actually benefit even more. So we can reimagine this discussion. It's not a zero sum. It's entirely, definitely not a zero sum. But we don't, our framework, yes, I love cost-benefit analysis, but we need to broaden it out beyond just the direct effect to the indirect effect. And I'll just, end on another wonky note. The Securities and Exchange Commission right down the street here has just launched a new way of telling publicly traded corporations that they need to look at the direct, indirect, and induced effects of climate. You can do that for ESG, on social impact as well. So it turns out there is methodology to be able to look at, and that's in a way sort of a bit to break out. It's not some approach to some dogma that equity has a value. It actually can be shown to be, can be measured to have a value, not just some type of normative value. It has a real positive way of integrating the entire society and making us all a much more functioning society and democracy.
Can I just add one little bit to that? One thing that I think is really important too is once all of that work is done, finding a new way, a vocabulary to talk about it with the public. I read an essay many years ago by Mike Rose, and it was talking about like the vocabulary that we use with school and with education, and how it's really important to teach the public a new vocabulary around schooling, because I may not even understand like what all of the different data sets and everything look like, but I will need to understand like a summary statement in a new vocabulary, and zero sum is one of those things that is embedded in our culture. So how do we shift that narrative?
We're now coming to the end of our time together. I wanted to make a couple of comments. It seems to me that both this earlier today and this session have really been about urgency, about opportunity, and about lost opportunities. And there we have lots of opportunities to take advantage of, but we've got to get smart about how to not lose those opportunities. I just saw the other day that immigration is now the #1 issue in the country as we go into elections. This happens every time. We just go beat up the immigrants, and that will convince people that they ought to vote in a certain way. It's really a shame. We've done research at the Civil Rights Project that shows that not only do the immigrants suffer from this kind of treatment, but the students, the young people, the children of immigrants who are citizens themselves are suffering from what we're doing about immigration. That their schools are suffering because teachers don't know how to cope with the tremendous concerns that the kids have about their parents. They come together. Under Obama, there was an attempt to do something like DAPA, the Deferred Action for Parents of arrivals. Is it arrivals?
Arrivals.
Yeah. That went nowhere, but it's so critically important to be thinking about this because we're losing a generation. We have millions of kids in this situation where they're citizens. They're due every right and privilege that any other citizen, but they can't take advantage of it because of our policies and our failure to document. We've also found in the civil rights work that we've done at the project that that if you're an immigrant and you get documented or you get green card, you've got a good future. If you are undocumented, you're going nowhere. And we have now, for decades, done nothing about fixing our broken immigration system, but just the kinds of benefits that Raul talks about in terms of financial benefits, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. So we need to think about that. Bilingual, languages other than English in the United States are oftentimes referred to as the U.S. being the graveyard for languages. People come here and bring the richness of their languages from their home areas, and then by the third generation, they are gone. If we don't increase our immigration, and if we don't pay attention to the things that Manuel was talking about, we're going to lose what we know is a true benefit for the individuals and for society. The languages that people bring to us are valuable assets that result in earning more, getting more education, and doing better in life. So we need to be thinking about this. I think that's basically what I wanted to end on. We so appreciate your being here with us today. This has been terrific for us, and I want to thank this panel again for just a wonderful set of presentations. Gary, do you want to say anything before we wrap?
Yes.
I figured.
One of the things that people who look at this program and listen to what's been said today would say is, these people don't understand what's going on in politics. They're dreamers. That's exactly why we did this, because we don't think there's any solution in incremental politics right now. But we do know the history of civil rights. You know, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, there'd been 65 years when people weren't allowed to vote in major parts of our country. It seemed impossible to change that since everybody who had any power in all of those states was opposed and would use every resource they could. The same thing was true with school desegregation in the South. Everyone was opposed. Everyone signed the resistance proclamations that were issued. There was huge fight to integrate 9 children into the schools in Little Rock in 1950. It took paratroopers to do it. And yet the South became the most integrated part of the country in 5 years of enforcement of the Civil Rights Act. Huge changes have taken place in our country, but they're because people believed in things that seemed impossible. And if we don't have any possible solution in day-to-day politics, and we know what they're like because we get involved. We get calls from people who are fighting cases everywhere in the country all the time. Just last week, there was a decision made in Texas about 30,000 people coming in every month and getting paroled by the Biden administration for 2 years of work in the United States. Part of that decision was made because there was some research applied to it, support for litigators who were fighting those kinds of cases. There are a lot of little day-to-day fights that are important, but it's really important to have a vision about where the heck we're going and what we actually need to do. That's the kind of thing that came out when Gunnar Myrdal did his work, when President Truman issued the first civil rights report in 80 years, when the military was desegregated after World War II. All of these things seemed impossible, but they were actually done. The things that we're talking about are all really investments, if you think about it. They're all really investments, and we don't have a sustainable future. If you look at all the demographics that you heard about today, and you know all the inequalities that are connected to them, it's not a society that will be stable and successful. It's not a society, and it's a society that's at risk of really serious fractioning. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of military attacks. It collapsed because nobody wanted to be members of it anymore. It just dissolved. We have to think about our society, and we have to think about What are the rational steps that we can take? And the truth is that we know from research and from our own experience in this country that there are a lot of things that actually work that aren't that difficult. Most students who go to desegregated schools or live in diverse housing like it. It's not a problem. It's not subtracting from whites to give to blacks or to Latinos. It's an addition. It's helping everybody learn how to work and live in a diverse society. So we need to think about what to do day to day, what to think about the obstacles that we have now, one of which is this United States Supreme Court majority. That can be changed. You can change the membership of the Supreme Court if you have enough votes in the United States Senate, and we need to. Lincoln rose to power, the Republican Party rose because they opposed a Supreme Court decision named Dred Scott. We've got decisions like that being made right now, like the affirmative action case last summer, like the women's decisions. We need mobilization. The big changes in the country depend on mobilization and depend on movements that political parties embrace. That's what happened with the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s. It has to happen again. What these things are today that you heard about are not unrealistic. They are realistic in an unrealistic time. We have to think about how to make it actually happen. And that will take not just research, it will take people developing movements, making hard political decisions, and demonstrating things that we don't think are possible that actually turn out to be very beneficial. And it has to be done. The reason that we thought in terms of the long-term future is it's a long-term battle. But if we don't do it, it won't work.
Thank you. And thank you, Gary and Patricia, right? Definitely.